the 19th century, where fainting was practically a recreational sport. If you've ever thought modern life is dramatic, with people fainting at concerts, passing out in yoga class, or collapsing after checking rent prices, please know this. 1800s walked so we could wobble. Fainting wasn't just common back then, it was practically a national pastime, a social trend, a full-body reaction to, well, anything. The good news, you survived the century. The bad news, so did your corset. To understand why fainting was such a routine part of 19th century life, imagine waking up in a world where every day is a sensory obstacle course. You open your eyes and your bedroom is hot, your air is stale, the wallpaper is aggressively patterned, and someone is burning incense downstairs that smells like a bouquet of flowers left in a carriage for 3 weeks. Your clothes squeeze you like an affectionate but judgmental anaconda. Your breakfast is lukewarm porridge doing its best impression of sadness. And then someone knocks on your door and says, "We're having company today." At this point, you're not fainting, you're clocking out. But fainting wasn't just a biological glitch. It was also a social ritual, a cultural phenomenon baked into the drama-filled souffle that was 19th century life. Everyone, and I mean everyone, fainted. Men, women, the clergy, theatre actors, dinner guests, political leaders, the maid who had seen too much, the butler who wished he hadn't seen anything at all. Collapsing was basically a second language. Hello, travellers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Let's start with society's favourite fainting demographic, the upper and middle class ladies, whose day-to-day existence was a blend of polite conversation, social paranoia, and trying not to move their rib cages too much. These women were expected to be delicate, refined, ethereal creatures, more cloud than human, practically floating through parlours like decorative mist. The downside, clouds don't have lungs. These women did, but no one let them use them properly. Now, fainting wasn't seen as a medical emergency so much as a personality trait. In fact, the more proper a woman was, the more likely she was expected to faint, swoon, wilt, collapse, droop, or dramatically descend toward the nearest fainting couch, an actual piece of furniture whose entire job description was catch collapsing humans. Imagine a society so committed to losing consciousness that it invented special furniture for it. That's dedication. But women weren't the only ones dropping faster than a powdered wig in the wind. The men of the 1800s were also no strangers to the swoon. Picture a gentleman at the opera clutching his monocle, leaning forward to glimpse a powerful soprano note, and then immediately regretting it as his vision tunnels and he sinks gracefully into the crowd like a Victorian version of a fainting goat. If you think this is an exaggeration, remember, these were men raised on strict manners, boiling wool suits, and public expectations that allowed zero emotional ventilation. If a surprise happened, even a mild one, their bodies simply exited the conversation. Let's not forget public spaces, which were basically designed to trigger fainting spells. People gathered in crowded churches, overheated parlours, steamy factories, soot-filled streets, and jam-packed auditoriums lit by flickering gas lamps that turned every room into a warm, poorly ventilated mystery box. Standing in one of these places for more than 20 minutes meant your body was playing a game of how long can we pretend this is fine? Spoiler, it wasn't fine. And then there's the food, or the creative interpretation of food the 19th century often produced. Meals were heavy, odd, and sometimes aggressively seasoned. Desserts were filled with enough sugar to make a dentist spontaneously combust. Teas and tonics sometimes contained alcohol levels that could floor a rhinoceros. A single luncheon could leave you dizzy, sleepy, overwhelmed, and questioning life choices. Fainting wasn't a surprise, it was a digestive review. But fainting wasn't always accidental. No, sometimes it was a choice, a tool, a strategy, in an era when subtle emotional communication was considered The height of sophistication and direct honesty was, well, suspicious. Fainting became a socially acceptable form of expressing displeasure. Shock, excitement, moral disapproval, dramatic flair, or simply wanting to leave a boring conversation. Think of it as the 1800s version of "I'm logging off." Did your cousin announce yet another engagement? Faint. Did a man you barely know offer you unsolicited advice? Faint. Did someone say something mildly scandalous like, "I prefer coffee to tea," collapse immediately and let the room gasp? Fainting was also theatrical, especially in literature and stage performances. A heroine wasn't truly a heroine unless she fainted at least once, the Victorian equivalent of a character arc. Actors fainted so convincingly that sometimes the audience fainted in sympathy, creating a chain reaction of collapses that probably kept the fainting couch industry thriving. Finally, let's not underestimate the 1800s' absolute obsession with nerves. Nerves explained everything. Headaches, indecision, shyness, indigestion, moral panic, and of course, fainting. People believed their nerves were delicate, fluttering, unpredictable things that needed constant protecting. Today we just call that anxiety. They called it being fashionable. In short, fainting wasn't a bug in 19th century life, it was a feature. A dramatic punctuation mark in a century overloaded with strict social rules, heavy clothing, mysterious health beliefs, and environments that ranged from mildly suffocating to Victorian sauna with decorative curtains. So tighten your laces, take a deep breath, if your outfit allows it, and prepare yourself. Because the 1800s weren't just full of fainting, they were full of reasons to faint, and in the next chapters, we're exploring them one by one. If you had to pick one object from the 19th century that caused more chaos than political scandals, more discomfort than a Victorian toilet, and more fainting spells than the average opera season, it would be the corset. Not the loose, gentle kind you see in costume dramas, no. We're talking about the industrial-strength waist-squeezing devices that turn the human torso into something resembling an hourglass, experiencing an existential crisis. Victorian corsets weren't just clothing, they were architecture, engineered with the same philosophy as bridges and cathedrals: compress, control, constrict, and hope. Nothing collapses. At the heart of corset culture was the belief that a small waist equaled moral superiority. If your waist was tiny, society assumed your manners were delicate, your spirit was pure, and your soul glowed with angelic light. Meanwhile, your organs were in the back, screaming like factory workers on strike. The ideal waist size was so small it could politely hide behind a lamppost. Some women achieved measurements that would make modern tailors question whether they were fitting a person or a decorative vase. Medical records from the time noted ribs displacing inward, stomachs tilting awkwardly, and livers protesting like overworked employees. A fully laced corset didn't just squeeze, it rearranged. Breathing became a luxury. Deep breaths were for people with poor morals. If you could breathe, one etiquette guide implied, your corset was considered too loose and therefore socially suspicious. Being suspicious meant you were in danger of looking comfortable, and comfort was un-Victorian, so women cinched tighter. But the greatest danger wasn't just the pressure, it was timing. A woman rarely dressed alone. She had a team, or at least one very determined maid, whose job was to pull those laces with the enthusiasm of someone trying to start a very stubborn lawnmower. Morning dressing rooms were less glamour and grace and more competitive tug-of-war, with the maid bracing her foot against the bed to get extra leverage as she yanked the lacing cords. Of course, the moment a tightly laced woman stood up, her body did the Victorian equivalent of saying, "Mama, I don't think we can do this today," and promptly diverted all available energy into staying upright. Many failed, and thus fainting, lots of fainting, more fainting than in a room full of Victorian novel heroines. But corset-induced fainting wasn't random, it followed predictable patterns. Corset fainting scenario 1, the outdoor collapse. Imagine strolling through a garden party, parasol in hand, posture perfect, ribcage compressed into a shape normally reserved for decorative cutlery. The sun is warm, the air is humid, and your lungs are quietly sending their final goodbyes. Halfway through complimenting someone's hydrangeas, your knees turn into philosophical suggestions rather than functional joints. Down you go, gracefully, like a flower petal falling in slow motion, except the flower petal isn't wearing 12 layers of clothing. Corset fainting scenario 2, the surprise emotional event. Victorian life was full of small shocks, an unexpected visitor, a minor social misstep, or a comment like, "My dear, that lace is last season." With a corset on, emotional shock became physical shock. Your diaphragm, already pushed somewhere south of where nature intended, panicked. The result? A stylish, dramatic swoon that told everyone, "I have feelings, but also no oxygen." Corset fainting scenario 3, the public ceremony. Disaster churches, ballrooms and theatres demanded long periods of sitting still in outfits that transformed normal breathing into a complex logistical challenge. Add candles, body heat, perfumes, and the great 19th century hobby of forgetting to open a window, and you get heat stroke waiting to happen. Women fainted in pews, in balconies, during speeches, during waltzes, and sometimes simply while observing someone else faint. Corsets also interfered with digestion, because your stomach couldn't exactly do its job when it was folded like a Victorian love letter. This meant heartburn, dizziness, nausea, and occasionally fainting, especially after meals that included 4 courses of meats, puddings, and sauces dense enough to qualify as building materials. And then there was the fashion escalation problem, the waist race. If one woman appeared with a tiny waist, another would tighten hers even more, and so on, until everyone was engaged in an unspoken battle of structural compression. Think of it like the Victorian version of social media filters. Every year the standard became more unrealistic. Of course, not everyone loved corsets. Doctors repeatedly warned that organs disliked being folded into origami shapes. Satirists mocked the fainting epidemics. Some husbands complained that their wives were too fragile to accompany them anywhere without collapsing like a decorative tent. But the corset survived all criticism because it symbolized elegance, beauty, and the ultimate Victorian goal, looking perfect while feeling absolutely terrible. By the end of the century, corset technology even advanced into bizarre new forms: ventilated corsets, sports corsets, pregnancy corsets, bathing corsets. Yes, waterproof compression exists, and even hygienic corsets advertised as healthier while being very much not healthy. The 1800s were a time when your clothes didn't just dress you. They restrained you, sculpted you, disciplined you, and occasionally knocked you unconscious. And nowhere was this more evident than in the corset, the era's favourite accessory for ensuring that beauty came with a complementary side of dizziness. So if you ever feel uncomfortable in modern fashion, remember, no one today expects you to squeeze your internal organs like damp laundry and call it elegance. If the 1800s had a list of things that could destroy public decency, ankles ranked surprisingly high, somewhere between too much laughter and dancing faster than a slow waltz. It wasn't that the Victorian ankle itself was inherently dangerous. It was just forbidden, scandalous, taboo in a way that makes you wonder how Britain managed to run an empire while being terrified of basic human joints. To understand ankle panic, you must imagine a world where showing a wrist was mildly daring, revealing a collarbone was flirting at Olympic level, and exposing an ankle was basically Victorian shock therapy. Morality guides warned young ladies against trousers, boots with short hems, and stepping too enthusiastically while walking, lest fabric lift and disaster strike. And by disaster, I mean the possibility that someone might briefly glimpse the part of your leg that connects your foot to your personality. One peek at a stocking, and society collectively rebooted. Victorians built their entire aesthetic on concealment, layers upon layers of it. Fabric didn't just cover the body, it smothered it like a well-meaning grandmother, piling blankets on you until you lost circulation. Women wore petticoats, multiple skirts, underdrawers, stockings, boots, and sometimes additional protective layers to ensure that ankles stayed hidden like national secrets. The ankle was a treasure chest nobody was allowed to open, and yet, because of all that secrecy, the ankle acquired a strange, powerful mystique, the kind that made poets sigh, painters obsess, and onlookers faint without warning. When something is hidden for long enough, it becomes fascinating. When it's forbidden, it becomes irresistible. And when it accidentally appears in public, well, that's fainting fuel. Picture a Victorian street, quiet, orderly, full of starched collars and polished boots. A respectable woman steps down from a carriage, misjudges the height, and her skirt lifts half an inch. She reveals, brace yourself, the curved outline of her ankle. A man nearby drops his hat. Another clutches his chest. A woman gasps like she's witnessing the sun explode. A clergyman saintly prays for humanity. A child has no idea what's happening but faints anyway to fit in. This was not because Victorians were weak-willed or overly sheltered, though to be fair, the era did treat emotions like unexploded bombs. It was because modesty culture heavily linked morality, femininity, and self-control to not being seen. A visible ankle suggested movement, independence, or even daring. The simple act of taking a confident step could be misread as a Victorian version of rebellious self-expression. Theatres capitalised on this. That's right, theatre producers would sometimes stage productions where a character, usually a comedic one, flashed an ankle for shock value. Patrons attended these shows specifically for the thrill. In some cities, critics even complain that the display of feminine ankles encourages indecency. Imagine living in a time where your entertainment options included ankle drama. There were even ankle scandals, real ones. Newspapers occasionally reported incidents involving women whose skirts flew up in the wind, men arrested for trying to peek under crinolines, or fashion critics lamenting that some dresses were cut too high above the boot, not too high above the knee, above the boot. People weren't fainting at legs, they were fainting at ankles like babies. They were high-voltage wires. Footwear advertisements also had to be careful. When illustrations showed boots or stockings on female figures, artists had to maintain respectable proportions. Too much curve around the ankle was considered risque. Yes, even commercial sketch artists lived in fear of accidentally inventing foot fetishism. But modesty culture had another side effect: ankle communication. Since direct flirting was about as socially acceptable as arson, people got creative. A small glimpse of an ankle could operate as a subtle signal, an I see you moment between romantic hopefuls bound by strict propriety. At garden parties, a woman stepping deliberately over a low stone or flower bed might reveal a flash of ankle to her secret admirer. A man noticing such an act might turn red, gulp air, and politely faint behind a bush. These interactions were the Victorian equivalent of modern dating apps. Awkward, unclear, and heavily reliant on hope. Of course, not everyone took ankle panic so seriously. Satirists and cartoonists mocked it relentlessly. They published illustrations of fainting gentlemen, scandalized matrons, and runaway skirts causing moral chaos. One famous cartoon depicted a whole line of men collapsing domino style after an accidental skirt lift at a train station. And the public loved it, because deep down, everyone knew the ankle taboo was as absurd as it was persistent. But for the truly faint-hearted, the ankle was more than a moral concern. It was a neurological trigger. Seeing something unexpected, especially something society insisted was dangerous, could jolt the system. A surprising ankle sighting was the Victorian equivalent of jump scares, unexpected, abrupt, and socially unacceptable. Combine this with the era's obsession with delicate nerves, and you get an entire generation conditioned to collapse like folding chairs. By the late 19th century, fashion began to shift. Hemlines rose slightly, boots changed shape, and the ankle lost some of its scandalous power. But it never truly disappeared from the fainting landscape. Even in the early 1900s, moral commentators still warned against the dangers of indecent ankle display, as if the joint itself was plotting societal downfall. The truth is, the ankle wasn't dangerous. Victorian expectations were. They created a world where natural human anatomy could trigger shockwaves, where modesty became melodrama, and where fainting wasn't just a reaction, it was practically a form of cultural punctuation. If you have ever walked past someone wearing too much cologne and felt your soul leave your body, congratulations. You now understand Victorian fragrance culture, except their version was stronger. Much stronger. Strong enough to knock out an adult horse, a small crowd, or an entire ballroom of unsuspecting guests who simply wanted to socialise without inhaling a chemical weapon. Victorian perfumes were not delicate florals resting gently upon the air. They were olfactory sledgehammers, bold, unapologetic, and scientifically questionable. Perfume making in the 1800s was less careful artistry and more, I mix this with that, and nobody died yet, so let's sell it. One whiff and boom, you're horizontal before the bottle cap even clicks shut. To understand why perfume was so intense, we must first appreciate the Victorian fear of bad smells. Strongly influenced by miasma theory, the belief that disease spread through foul air, people thought pleasant scents could protect them from illness. In other words, the worse the world smelled, and trust me, Victorian cities smelled like a mixture of horses, coal smoke, questionable rivers, and regret. The stronger people believed their perfumes needed to be. So they layered scent on scent, soaking handkerchiefs, lace cuffs, clothing, gloves, hair, and occasionally pets. Perfume wasn't subtle, it was self-defense. Now, if perfumes had been made from gentle natural oils, that might have been fine. But Victorian perfumers weren't exactly operating under modern safety standards. Some scents were crafted with substances you'd normally find in apothecaries, laboratories, or graveyards. Let's begin with the classic. Musk, often derived from glands of deer. Strong, pungent, and so potent that a drop could linger for weeks. But Victorians didn't want a drop. They wanted enough musk to fumigate a ballroom. There were also civet and ambergris, delightful if you ignore the fact that one comes from a cat-like creature's rear glands and the other is digested whale matter. Then came the floral dream blends, which sound innocent until you realise the extraction processes were imprecise. Flowers were steeped in fats, alcohols, oils, and occasionally random substances perfumers had lying around because it smells kind of nice if you squint your nose. Some mixtures aged in copper pots, some in lead containers, and some simply fermented until no one remembered what went in to begin with. Victorians adored heavy scents like patchouli, jasmine and ylang-ylang, all of which can be lovely, but not when worn at volumes that could knock bystanders unconscious. Patchouli especially had a reputation for overpowering entire rooms. Many fainting spells at parties weren't caused by emotion, heat or shock. They were caused by the event's most scented attendee drifting by like a fragrant storm cloud. Women weren't the only ones responsible for olfactory assaults. Victorian men also wore colognes, but theirs often contained tonics, spirits and stimulants, creating perfumes that smelled like aggressive forests or dangerously enthusiastic citrus orchards. One popular men's fragrance included conifer resin, brandy, and something described only as aromatic salts. Think of it as Victorian body spray, if body spray had the ability to strip paint. But overpowering scents weren't the only danger. Some perfumes were literally toxic. Museums today possess 19th century perfume bottles that still contain trace elements of arsenic, mercury, and lead. A fun reminder that Victorian beauty sometimes came with an optional side quest called accidental poisoning. Perfumed gloves, a fashionable staple, were often tanned or softened with harsh chemicals that seeped through the skin. People occasionally fainted just putting them on. Imagine dressing for a party and passing out before leaving your room because your gloves are trying to assassinate you. And then there were pomanders, small balls filled with scented materials people carried to ward off bad smells. In theory, excellent. In practice, these sometimes contained overpowering mixtures that marinated in enclosed spaces like carriages or theatres. Sitting next to someone with a pomander could feel like being trapped inside a flower shop that just lost a fight with a spice market. Perfume etiquette was also strict. Upper-class women were expected to smell like luxury, refinement, and 11 different kinds of botanical intensity. Servants, on the other hand, were discouraged from wearing scent at all. Too much perfume on someone without status was considered presumptuous. Too little on someone wealthy was negligent. There was no winning except for fainting couches, which got plenty of business. Perfume's fainting power was especially notorious in crowded social settings. Picture a ballroom packed with dancers, layers of clothing, flickering candles, minimal ventilation, and dozens of people wearing scents strong enough to stun livestock. By midnight, the room smelled like a competitive bouquet, and guests were dropping faster than the orchestra could keep up. Even doctors commented on perfume-related fainting, politely suggesting that perhaps people should stop bathing themselves in concentrated liquid flowers. Naturally, society ignored them. Satirical magazines poked fun at the trend as well. One cartoon depicted a man opening a lady's perfume bottle and immediately being blasted backward into a potted plant. Another showed a fashionable woman walking down the street while everyone behind her collapsed dramatically, like she were a fragrant Grim Reaper. By the end of the century, perfume manufacturing became more standardized, safer, and less reliant on questionable extraction methods. But the cultural memory of Victorian scent warfare remained. After all, few things in history caused as many fainting spells as the combination of ambition, fashion, and the belief that if it smelled strong, it must be healthy. If you've ever stepped into a crowded room and immediately felt like your lungs were filing complaints, congratulations, you've just had a tiny taste of what it was like to enter a Victorian parlour. These rooms were not designed for comfort, airflow, or human survival. They were designed for aesthetic suffocation, a kind of decorative heat trap where people gathered to socialise, court, gossip, wilt, and occasionally pass out with the grace of a collapsing bookshelf. Because if the 1800s mastered anything, it wasn't ventilation. It was creating indoor spaces that doubled as slow-cooking environments for humans. The air wasn't stuffy, it was a crime scene waiting to happen. To understand why Victorian indoor gatherings produced fainting like factories produce smoke, we must first understand two important principles. Victorians believed fresh air was suspicious. Victorians believed open windows were gateways to moral and physical ruin. Yes, open windows. Those innocent glass rectangles were considered dangerous portals through which disease, cold air, bad spirits, and general misfortune might stroll in without knocking. Medical books warned about the horrors of draughts, which Victorians treated like airborne assassins. Children were raised to fear sitting near windows. Adults hung heavy curtains across every opening. Some households even sealed windows shut for the winter, trusting in fireplaces and hoped to carry them through. This led to a nationwide architectural theme: indoor air that never moved. And nowhere was this more punishing than the parlour, the beating heart of Victorian social life, beating very slowly because the oxygen levels were low. Consider the average gathering. A group of people dressed in multiple layers of clothing, including fabrics determined to hold body heat hostage, crowding into a room filled with heavy drapery, upholstered furniture, a roaring fireplace, and several dozen candles. Add thick carpeting, thick wallpaper, thick curtains, and thick social expectations, and you get a room so insulated it could double as a steam bath. The parlour was meant to be inviting, elegant, and refined. Instead, it became a thermal chokehold with seating arrangements. Guests entered the room, smiled politely, and pretended the air wasn't slowly defeating them. Men dabbed their foreheads discreetly. Women fluttered fans like hummingbirds trying to escape danger. Hosts pretended not to notice that half their visitors were turning pink at the edges. Then there were the fireplaces. Victorians adored their fireplaces, and for good reason. Winters were cold, houses were drafty in the bad ways, and insulation was mostly wishful thinking. But during gatherings, hosts tended to keep the fire roaring to create an atmosphere of hospitality. Unfortunately, with all windows closed and doors shut, this hospitality quickly became heat accumulation. Fireplaces didn't just warm parlours, they punished them. And let's not forget the lighting. Gas lamps produced heat. Oil lamps produced heat. Candles produced heat. Even the guests produced heat, because Victorian clothing was basically thermal insulation disguised as fashion. By mid-evening, a parlour wasn't just cosy, and it was as a human terrarium. People fainted constantly. At first, the symptoms crept in subtly. Flushed cheeks, rapid breathing, slight dizziness. These were the warning signs that the parlour environment was preparing the guests for a slow descent into unconsciousness. Then came the telltale fan fluttering. Women waving their fans with the urgency of someone trying to signal distress to passing ships. Men loosened their collars when no one was looking. Children simply accepted their fate. Finally, inevitably, someone swooned. Victorian hosts knew the procedure well. A guest would sway, blink slowly, and then glide downwards in a manner society liked to call graceful, but which actually resembled a melting candle. A nearby footman or relative would swoop in, guiding the fainting victim to the fainting couch. Because yes, parlours were sometimes equipped with one, like a hospital ward that specialised in dramatic collapses. What made parlour fainting especially common wasn't just the heat, it was duration. These social visits lasted hours. Hours. People gathered for tea, stayed through music performances, engaged in stiff conversation, endured long pauses where everyone listened to someone read aloud, all while slowly roasting alive. Some homes even had multiple parlours, and hosts would shuffle guests between them during social events. The air quality did not improve in the second room. It simply shifted from nearly deadly to fully committed to the cause. And then there was the perfume factor, not repeated from the previous chapter, but important here in a different way. When 20 people wearing intense fragrances stood shoulder to shoulder in an unventilated parlour, the air didn't just thicken, it compounded. The heat mingled with scent, creating an atmospheric cocktail strong enough to produce tears, headaches, and spontaneous floor napping. Even doctors noticed the problem. Medical journals politely suggested that perhaps parlours needed more ventilation, but Victorian households responded by adding heavier curtains and more furniture. Comfort was not the goal. Aesthetic density was. Parlours were also symbolic spaces, the place where one performed civility, refinement, and social bravado. This meant no one dared complain about feeling faint. Doing so implied weakness, poor constitution, or worse, impropriety. So guests simply endured the baking, stewing atmosphere until their bodies decided for them. And parlour fainting was socially acceptable, even charming. A fainting spell could attract sympathy, admiration, or even romantic attention. Such delicate sensibilities. People murmured approvingly. They didn't run to open a window. They ran to fetch water, fans, smelling salts, anything except common sense. By the late 19th century, some households adopted better heating and ventilation, but the cultural fear of drafts lingered. Parlours remained warm, cosy traps well into the early 20th century. Because in the Victorian world, a little fainting was preferable to even the slightest risk of someone feeling a breeze. If modern proposals are emotional, rings hidden in desserts, rooftop dinners, beach sunsets, then Victorian proposals were ambush-level surprises that could trigger fainting fits so spectacular they should have come with medical disclaimers. Today people cry when they're proposed to. In the 1800s, they collapsed. Romance wasn't a gentle process. It was a full-body reaction, because nothing says romance like collapsing into the nearest decorative plant. To understand why proposals carried the shock value of a horror movie jump scare, you need to understand the emotional architecture of Victorian courtship, a system designed to encourage intense feelings while forbidding any normal expression of them. Imagine being told to fall in love but also remain absolutely expressionless about it. Imagine having feelings but needing to request permission before showing any sign of them. Imagine crushing on someone while also pretending they don't exist unless spoken to directly. That was Victorian romance. 10% mutual affection, 90% prolonged eye contact across a room, and 100% suppressed emotions waiting to explode. Now add strict social rules. Victorian etiquette manuals describe proposals with the seriousness of military handbooks. There were proper procedures for everything: how a man must ask permission to propose, how a woman must not appear too eager, how families must not display excitement, and, most importantly, how no one must ever appear to be feeling anything. It was like conducting a romantic transaction inside a library, where every emotional response above a whisper was strictly forbidden. So when a proposal finally happened, the shock hit like a rogue wave. Many Victorian women spent weeks, even months, being politely courted by sen who spoke in carefully measured tones, complimented them on things like temperament or needlework proficiency, and avoided any sign of impropriety. Then suddenly, BAM! The man was declaring eternal love with a seriousness that felt like a courtroom confession. No wonder fainting became a default reaction. The classic parlor proposal collapse picture. A woman sitting in a heavily furnished Victorian parlour, sipping tea that tastes like hot disappointment. A man she has known for 3 months, whose hand she has never touched, whose emotion she has only inferred from the angle of his eyebrows, suddenly stands, clears his throat and begins a speech that starts with "my dearest" and rapidly escalates to lifelong devotion. Before she can process it, her world narrows, her heartbeat spikes, and her vision fogs over like a carriage window in winter. This isn't because she doesn't like him. It's because Victorian society trained her to feel nothing until the moment someone blasts her with love like a cannon. She faints. The ficus plant behind her becomes an uncredited actor in the proposal scene. The garden proposal meltdown. Sometimes proposals occurred outside where at least there was fresh air, theoretically an advantage. But the emotional shock still hit hard, and the uneven ground of Victorian gardens did not help. Countless diaries record proposals followed by women sinking dramatically into rose bushes, flower beds, or ornamental shrubs. One young woman wrote that she momentarily lost consciousness and awoke among the tulips, which might be the most poetic faint in history. Surprise proposals were also known to occur near staircases, usually disastrous. It wasn't uncommon for a man to confess his feelings as a woman ascended or descended a set of stairs, which resulted in dramatic collapses that actors today would envy. Victorian fainting wasn't delicate, it was chaotic. Staircases became dangerous terrains, not because they were steep, but because emotional vulnerability was not in the Victorian vocabulary. While physical causes of fainting, heat, clothing, scent, affected other chapters, the fainting triggered by proposals was almost entirely emotional shock, something the Victorian environment amplified. Romantic expectations were enormous. Marriage was not just love, it was social status, financial security, and family honour all rolled into one. Women were raised to be passive. Being directly asked a life-altering question triggered overwhelm. Men were raised to perform bravery. Proposing was terrifying, and fainting sometimes occurred on their side too. Emotional repression was the norm. Feelings suppressed for months erupted all at once. Victorians treated romance like a pressure cooker, tightly sealed, bubbling constantly and prone to explosive outcomes. Some proposals were dramatic even by Victorian standards. Last-minute proposals before long travel. A man might announce he was leaving for India the next morning and pop the question, causing women to faint from emotional whiplash. Family-arranged proposals delivered suddenly. Imagine learning you're being proposed to by someone you've spoken to twice. Fainting was the polite alternative to screaming. Public proposals, rare but dangerous. Being emotionally overwhelmed in public was so shocking that women often fainted out of pure social panic. Ironically, fainting was socially convenient. It allowed a woman to avoid answering immediately. It signalled modesty and propriety. I am overwhelmed by this declaration. It provided an escape from the awkwardness of the moment. In some etiquette guides, fainting is even described as a natural response to strong emotion. Natural, yes, in the same way earthquakes are natural. Once revived with smelling salts, the woman would regain consciousness, sip water, pretend the collapse was very unlike her, and delicately respond. Sometimes she accepted, sometimes she declined, sometimes she fainted again. Victorians were committed to dramatic arcs. Surprise proposals weren't moments of calm, gentle romance. They were emotional booby traps hidden inside stiff clothing, strict customs, and repressed emotions. Proposals in the 1800s weren't just declarations of love, they were high-stakes ambushes capable of flooring even the most socially prepared individual. If you've ever wondered how medicine functioned before modern science stepped in and said, absolutely not, allow me to introduce you to one of history's favourite hobbies, bloodletting. In the 1800s, people believed that almost every ailment, headaches, fevers, indigestion, melancholy, boredom, and possibly poor fashion choices, could be fixed by removing some of your blood, not examining it, not studying it, just letting it out like a badly behaved pet. The cure worked great if your illness was having too much blood. Bloodletting wasn't merely a treatment, it was a philosophy. A commitment to the idea that the human body was constantly conspiring against itself by producing more blood than any respectable person needed. Too much blood, they reasoned, created imbalances. An imbalance was the root of all evil, or at least the root of your headache. To be fair, bloodletting had been around for centuries, but the 1800s perfected it with the confidence of a society that had not yet met germ theory. Doctors carried kits filled with gleaming instruments designed specifically for making people leak. Lancets, fleams, scarificators, and even specialised cups. Some of these tools looked so dramatic they could have been props from a Gothic novel. Sharp, shiny, and ready to make you question your doctor's career choices. Patients rarely questioned anything, though. Doctors were authority figures, trained professionals, and experts in the fine art of draining their clients until the room spun like a carousel. In many households, a doctor showing up with a bloodletting kit was as normal as someone arriving with a first aid box today. Except instead of bandages and antiseptic, the kit contained ways to turn you into a fainting hazard. Bleeding was prescribed for everything. Let's list some genuine conditions Victorian doctors treated with bloodletting: fever, sore throat, pneumonia, headaches, insomnia, nerves, constipation, general weakness, ironic considering the treatment, overexcitement of the mind, usually meaning you read a book too quickly. If symptoms didn't improve, many physicians came to the same conclusion. Clearly you have not been bled enough. The solution? More bloodletting. Some patients were drained multiple times in a single week, some multiple times in a single day. It was the medical equivalent of giving someone a haircut and insisting the solution to a bad haircut is more haircut. Fainting wasn't a side effect, it was expected. Doctors weren't shocked when patients fainted. In fact, fainting proved the treatment was working. After all, if the goal was to reduce blood volume and the result was dizziness, pallor and unconsciousness, the doctor could interpret that as success. It was a moment of quiet professional pride. Excellent. The patient is horizontal. The treatment has taken effect. Some physicians even recommended bleeding until fainting occurred, describing it as a therapeutic endpoint. When you passed out, the doctor simply leaned back, satisfied that balance had been restored. Leeches, nature's little medical assistants. If bloodletting tools weren't available, or if a doctor wanted a more natural option, leeches were the next best thing. Victorian medical leeches were not your everyday pond dwellers. These were farmed, specially collected, and sometimes imported, because Europeans used so many they created leech shortages. Imagine needing so many leeches that an entire industry rose up just to keep the supply flowing. Doctors applied leeches to a variety of body parts depending on the condition. Migraine, attach them near your temples. Stomachache, onto the abdomen they go. Sore throat, a handful under the chin should do nicely. Nothing says medical authority like placing a squirming blood vacuum on someone's neck and calling it science. Patients often fainted during leech treatments too, not just from blood loss, but from the psychological trauma of watching a small creature slurp them like medically sanctioned spaghetti. The home bloodletting movement. You might imagine bloodletting happening only in doctors' offices, but many families practiced it at home. Upper-class homes sometimes kept leeches in fancy containers, ready to be deployed whenever someone felt overly flushed. Some households owned personal lancets, the precursor to that one terrifying drawer in every modern bathroom where unidentifiable items go to retire. Family members would apply leeches like they were sticking on decorative accessories. Children were bled, elderly parents were bled, travellers carried portable kits so they could bleed themselves on the road. People bled before long journeys, after long journeys, before dinner, after dinner, and occasionally just because it had been a slow afternoon. It's hard to faint gracefully when your own family is medically mugging you. Hospitals turned bloodletting into a sport. In hospital wards, bloodletting sometimes happened assembly line style. Patients were lined up, treated in quick succession, and then left to recline, recover, or faint in peace. Some hospitals recorded draining over 100 ounces from a single patient. For reference, the average adult has around 60 ounces of blood total. If you're wondering how those patients survived, many didn't. Doctors blamed the disease, not the practice. Fashion, social status, and bloodletting. Strangely enough, bloodletting had social implications too. Being bled regularly suggested you could afford professional medical attention, a kind of grim Victorian flex. Some wealthy people had standing appointments, like wellness subscriptions, except instead of yoga classes, it involved voluntary exsanguination. The slow, bloody fall of bloodletting. By the mid to late 1800s, medical science finally started catching up. Germ theory arrived, microscopes improved, and physicians realized perhaps removing buckets of blood from fragile patients wasn't the miracle they thought. Slowly, bloodletting declined, though it never fully disappeared until the early 20th century. But during its 19th century heyday, fainting from bloodletting wasn't tragic, surprising, or unusual. It was simply how medicine worked, or rather, how medicine didn't work. Victorians walked into doctors' offices hoping for healing and walked out dizzy, pale, weak, and occasionally unconscious. But hey, according to the medical wisdom of the time, that meant everything was going great. When Wilhelm Röntgen discovered X-rays in 1895, he didn't just revolutionize science, he accidentally traumatized half the world. Because nothing prepares you for the experience of suddenly being able to see inside yourself. The human body had spent thousands of years minding its own business, keeping bones neatly tucked away like private diary entries. Then suddenly, bam! Technology arrived and said, "Hey, want to see your skeleton?" Imagine seeing your bones and thinking you were being haunted internally. Victorians weren't emotionally ready. These were people who fainted at ankles, panicked over fresh air, and believed too much laughter might harm the soul. And now someone was pointing a strange glowing machine at them and showing them what their ribcage looked like. It was a lot. A world before X-rays. Bones were, theoretical. Before the late 19th century, most ordinary people never saw bones unless they dug them up, concerning. They were doctors, less concerning but debatable, or they were reading a medical book full of drawings, frequently faint-inducing. People knew bones were inside them, of course, but in that vague abstraction of the body sort of way, like knowing your taxes exist but not wanting to actually look at them. Then came the X-ray machine, which treated the body like a surprise gift with transparent wrapping paper. First reactions: panic, shock, existential crises. When early patients saw their X-rays, they reacted with the same energy as someone discovering a ghost living rent-free in their torso. Reactions ranged from gasping, screaming, fainting, declaring themselves cursed, or asking the technician whether the bones belonged to someone else. One woman reportedly burst into tears because she thought the X-ray showed she had a monster inside her. Another man fainted upon seeing his hand's skeleton because he believed the image predicted his death. And honestly, from their perspective, it made sense. Victorians had just spent decades terrified of spirits, seances, ghosts and supernatural signs. Then suddenly a machine showed them glowing skeletal remains in their own body. If your worldview is built on the idea that invisible forces are everywhere, seeing your bones on a screen feels like confirmation that the afterlife has started early. The machines were terrifying all on their own. Early X-ray devices did not look like medical tools. They looked like steampunk wizardry. Buzzing tubes glowing with eerie blue light, electrical wires everywhere, crackling static, strange clicking noises, sometimes sparks, and technicians wearing full suits or protective aprons that looked suspiciously like ritual garments. If someone told you they were communicating with spirits using it, you'd believe them. Patients sat completely still while the machine hummed ominously, because early X-rays took several minutes, not milliseconds. That means you weren't shown a crisp digital image. You were shown something that looked like a haunted photograph of your insides. It's a miracle people didn't faint more often. Early medical rooms, hotbeds of emotional chaos. Doctors, thrilled by this new invention, invited patients to try it out like it was an amusement park attraction. Come see the bones in your own hand. What do you mean? Why is the machine sparking? That's normal. No, that glowing tube is not going to explode, probably. Patients, already anxious, would tentatively place their hands in front of the screen, watch the outline of their bones materialize like Victorian horror art, and immediately regret everything that led them to this moment. Imagine being told your body contains solid sticks, a cage, and multiple joints that bend only because you have internal hinges. That's a lot for a person still getting used to bicycles. X-rays as party entertainment. Yes, it happened. Wealthy households in the late 1890s purchased early X-ray machines as entertainment. Dinner guests were invited into darkened rooms to see their inner selves. This sounds elegant until you realise that people fainted onto carpets worth more than their monthly income. Someone inevitably screamed. At least one guest claimed to have glimpsed death, and everyone left the room questioning their relationship with their own skeleton. It was the Victorian version of letting friends try VR goggles, except instead of virtual roller coasters, you got existential dread. Radiation, never heard of her. Nobody understood the dangers of early X-rays. Machines emitted doses that today would qualify as, please stop immediately. Technicians sometimes stood beside machines casually, unaware they were being slow-baked from the inside. Medical record photos from the time show early doctors holding unprotected hands under the machine dozens or hundreds of times a week. Patients often fainted not just from shock, but from sheer anxiety as the electrical equipment buzzed, flickered, or occasionally overheated. Is this safe? Well, the last patient didn't faint until after the exposure. So yes, absolutely. Superstitions and misunderstandings. Some Victorians believed X-rays could reveal sins, expose lies, damage the soul, erase memories, or pierce modesty in scandalous ways. Rumours spread that doctors could use X-rays to see through clothing. People panicked. Newspapers published cartoons of doctors peering through hats, jackets, and dresses. One clergyman declared X-rays an invasion of God's privacy laws. Women worried their corsets would appear in the images. They did. Men fretted their boots would show. They also did. People fainted simply from imagining the possibility. Scientific wonder meets human fragility. Despite the shock and the collapses, X-rays represented something incredible. The curtain lifting on the secret architecture of the human body. But Victorian society, already overwhelmed by rapid inventions, trains, telegraphs, automation, electricity, was not emotionally prepared for this level of scientific exposure. Seeing your bones wasn't just a medical experience, it was philosophical, spiritual, frightening and awe-inspiring. And for many it was simply too much. One look at their own skeleton and poof, straight to the floor. When gaslighting arrived in the 19th century, people expected progress, clarity and a comforting glow to guide them through the evening hours. What they got instead was an unpredictable, hissing, flickering light source that transformed every hallway into a suspense novel and every shadow into a jump scare. The shadows moved, so people assumed the afterlife came early. For a society already on edge about spirits, omens, emotional outbursts and sudden fainting spells, Gaslight wasn't just a technological advancement, it was an invitation for panic. Imagine stepping into a hallway lit by gas lamps for the first time. The flame inside the glass dome sputters, brightens, dims, and suddenly flares like it's trying to communicate with you. The shadows on the walls stretch long and trembling, bending around corners like dark fingers reaching for whatever courage you had left. Victorians weren't used to artificial light behaving like it was alive. Candlelight flickered gently, lantern light swayed predictably, but gaslight? Gaslight had mood swings. You didn't illuminate your home so much as invite unpredictable fire to hang out above your head while humming menacingly. The sound alone unsettled people. Gaslights hissed softly, sometimes loudly, and occasionally gave off tiny pops like they were chewing on air. For people raised on the belief that supernatural forces lingered in dark corners and unexplained noises were never a good sign, this was more than enough to trigger fainting. A hallway that hissed at you felt personal, as if something unseen were whispering warnings. Those already predisposed to nervousness felt their knees buckle the moment the lights started their nightly flickering theatrics. And then there was the smell. Early gas systems weren't subtle. They filled rooms with a faint, strange odour, something chemical, metallic and unfamiliar. The kind of smell that made you wonder whether you were breathing progress or poison. Some households complained that the smell made them dizzy, nauseated or oddly emotional. Others insisted the odour clouded the mind or made the air heavy. For people already fainting at perfumes, proposals, heat and medical procedures, a new mysterious indoor scent was basically an engraved invitation to drop. Gaslight also made shadows behave in ways shadows had never behaved before. They didn't remain politely still like candle-lit silhouettes. They jittered, stretched, swayed, and occasionally danced with the enthusiasm of spirits on holiday. A person could walk calmly down a hallway and suddenly see a shadow leap across the wall like an intruder, or worse, a ghost, and their body would immediately choose flight, fight, or faint. Given the Victorian track record, fainting usually won. Even servants who saw more of the practical world than their employers admitted that long hallways lit by gas often gave them the unnerving feeling that they were being followed. Homes weren't the only danger zones. Theatres embraced gaslight with enthusiasm, installing massive overhead burners to illuminate stages. Audiences marvelled at the brighter scenes, but the flickering, breathing quality of the light created eerie effects during performances, especially during dramatic pauses. People who came to watch a tragedy sometimes added their own tragic collapse in response to a shadow gliding across the backdrop like a supernatural cameo. One moment you were admiring an actor's monologue, and the next, boom, the flicker made a shape look a little too lifelike, and half the balcony needed smelling salts. Even the streets changed. Walking outside at night was suddenly a different kind of adventure. Gas lamps glowed in fog, turning every corner into a ghostly vignette. Victorian fog was thick, smoky and yellowish. Combined with gaslight, it created moving shapes that looked like figures appearing and disappearing. Travellers fainted because they thought they saw phantoms. Police patrolling fainted because they thought they saw criminals. Criminals fainted because they thought they saw police. No one was safe. Gas explosions added to the anxiety. Early systems sometimes leaked, causing sudden flares or loud bursts of flame from lamps. This was not comforting. Dinner parties were interrupted by lamps erupting like dramatic punctuation marks. Parlours glowed too bright for a second, then dimmed ominously, making everyone wonder if the building was about to erupt into a Victorian fireworks display. Guests fainted not only from fear, but from the embarrassment of having fainted in front of the host's new lighting installation. Even writers used gaslight as a tool of suspense. Gothic and mystery novels described flickering lamps revealing sinister shapes or casting deceptive silhouettes. And readers, already primed to faint at emotional tension, found themselves collapsing over fictional lighting problems as well. It was a perfect storm. Technology, imagination, and a cultural talent for fainting collided. Every new innovation comes with adjustments, and the Victorians were adjusting while dramatically crumpling onto upholstered furniture. Gaslight brightened their homes, transformed their cities, and lit their stages, but it also introduced a new atmosphere, one filled with unpredictability, strange noises, mysterious glows, and shadows that looked a little too alive. For a society fascinated by ghosts but terrified of seeing one, Gaslight turned every evening into a séance they didn't remember attending. Attending the opera in the 19th century wasn't just a night of culture, sophistication, and whispering judgments about everyone's outfits. It was also one of the most acoustically hazardous activities a person could engage in. People fainted at the opera so often that ushers practically developed reflexes for catching collapsing patrons. Those notes weren't high, they were atmospheric weapons. If you've ever felt a singer's voice vibrate through your skull, now imagine that happening when your brain is already convinced ghosts live in hallways and your outfit is compressing your lungs into decorative origami. The opera was the crown jewel of Victorian entertainment, a place where society gathered to see and be seen. But beneath the sparkle, glamour, and velvet curtains lay the truth. Opera halls were emotional minefields. People weren't simply attending a performance, they were willingly walking into a room where sound alone had the power to level them. For starters, 19th century operatic singers trained their voices like athletes. These weren't gentle melodies lightly drifting across the air. These were thunderbolts launched from human throats, crafted to fill enormous theatres without microphones, amplifiers, or anything except raw lung power and professional determination. A soprano's high note could rattle chandeliers. A tenor's passionate hysteria could make someone's knees wobble like poorly constructed scaffolding. Sometimes audiences fainted simply from the physical intensity of the resonance, the vibration settling into their ribcage like a polite earthquake. But fainting at the opera wasn't always about acoustics. Emotion played a massive role. Opera was designed to overwhelm. The tragic love stories, heart-wrenching betrayals, passionate declarations, and dramatic death scenes weren't subtle. Victorians, conditioned to suppress emotions in daily life, were suddenly confronted with an explosion of feeling delivered at 110 decibels. It was emotional whiplash. They spent all day maintaining polite expressions, then were hit with an aria so heartbreaking it punched straight through their self-control and into their circulation. Tears flowed, hearts raced, breath quickened, vision blurred, and then, inevitably, they fainted gracefully into their neighbour's lap. Opera houses also had the same ventilation problem as parlours, which meant the air grew hot, thick, and stale. Combine low oxygen with high emotions and booming music, and you had a recipe for synchronised swooning. People didn't just faint alone, sometimes several guests went down in waves, creating a domino effect of collapsing fans, top hats, and startled gasps. The show went on, of course. Opera singers trained to ignore everything, including occasional audience members being dragged sideways out of the row, like theatrical casualties. And then there were the special performances, the ones people talked about for weeks afterward. A legendary soprano known for her impossibly high notes might attract more spectators than the scandal of the month. Audiences sat in suspense, waiting for the moment she unleashed the note. As it soared, so did heart rates. If she hit it perfectly, cheers erupted from those still conscious. If she held it with surprising force, you could hear a faint thud or two as someone's body politely decided to disengage from the situation. Even newspapers reported on these reactions, writing polite lines like, "The emotional power of her performance left several ladies unsteady." Some fainting incidents were less noble. Imagine sitting in the opera enjoying the music when suddenly a bass singer reaches deep into his register and the ground itself seems to vibrate. For some listeners unprepared for the acoustic force field, the vibrating seats, walls and hearts created dizziness strong enough to short-circuit consciousness. Victorians didn't understand the science behind vibrations. They simply described it as overwhelming the nerves, which was polite language for the music punted them into unconsciousness. There were also moments when the staging itself caused fainting. Elaborate set pieces, surprise appearances, dramatic lighting effects, or sudden pyrotechnics sometimes tricked audiences into thinking something supernatural or dangerous had occurred. In an age where gaslight shadows already looked suspicious, watching a character emerge from smoke or hearing an offstage scream was enough to turn the opera into a fainting festival. Opera-related fainting wasn't limited to women either. Men fainted too, they just did it quietly, and tried to pretend afterward that they had merely stepped out for air. Some fainted due to emotion, others due to tight cravats, heavy coats, and the pressure of sitting still for 3 hours while attempting to appear cultured. A few fainted because the soprano they admired hit a note so stunning they forgot to breathe. Yet despite the risks, opera remained irresistible. It was one of the few places Victorians could safely lose themselves in art, passion and noise without judgment, even if losing themselves occasionally meant losing consciousness. Something about that combination of music, spectacle, heat and emotional release turned fainting into a semi-regular part of the experience, almost like an unspoken tradition. Applause, tears, wound, repeat. In the end, the opera didn't just entertain, it overwhelmed, impressed, stunned, and occasionally removed audience members from vertical existence. And the Victorians adored it for exactly that reason. If the 19th century had a signature scent, it would be a blend of coal smoke, damp wool, unwashed humanity, questionable rivers, and a faint note of desperation. Society was fragrant in all the wrong ways. Some smells were so powerful they could legally vote. It wasn't that Victorians wanted to overwhelm the senses, it was simply that hygiene standards were still warming up, like an engine that coughed for several decades before starting properly. Imagine walking down a Victorian street. Before you've taken 10 steps, you're greeted with the combined aroma of horse manure, chimney soot and a mysterious liquid someone dumped out of a window because the plumbing system was still theoretical. The air carried scents like a gossip columnist carried secrets, everywhere, constantly, whether you wanted them or not. For the faint of nose, this was not just unpleasant. It was fainting fuel. Victorian cities were growing fast and public sanitation was trying desperately to catch up, usually while apologising for running late. Bathing wasn't a daily routine for most people. Weekly baths were considered ambitious. Monthly baths were respectable. Some families bathed by rotation in the same tub of water, starting with the father and ending with the smallest child, who essentially marinated in the accumulated decisions of everyone before him. Soap existed, of course, but it wasn't used with modern enthusiasm. Some varieties were so harsh that washing your hands felt like negotiating with sandpaper. Laundry had similar issues. Washing clothing was labour-intensive, time-consuming and often reserved for special occasions. Many outfits maintained a long-term committed relationship with their smells. The average Victorian wore layers, lots of layers, all of which trapped warmth and odour like a complex ecosystem. Underclothes absorbed sweat but weren't changed as frequently as we might hope. Outer garments rarely saw a wash basin at all, instead being brushed, aired out, or simply ignored in hopes they cleaned themselves. Perfume helped mask some of this, but as we explored earlier, those scents often made things worse. Imagine the aroma of unwashed wool mingling with aggressive floral perfume. It was nature's version of a duel. People fainted trying to breathe through the battlefield. But the most powerful scents didn't come from clothing. They came from the environment. Factories belched smoke. Streets swarmed with horses that deposited their daily contributions generously. Butchers worked without refrigeration. Fishmongers displayed their goods proudly in the sun. And the Thames River, before reformers stepped in, was essentially a soup made of everything that shouldn't be in water. The Great Stink of 1858 didn't happen by accident. It was the natural conclusion of decades of industrial optimism combined with sewer systems playing hide and seek. Inside homes, the situation wasn't always better. Without modern plumbing, chamber pots served as the nightly solution to nature's calls. These pots were emptied in the morning, hopefully. Sometimes they were forgotten, sometimes they were tipped into the street, sometimes they were emptied into cesspits that overflowed. In tightly packed neighbourhoods, smells drifted from house to house like uninvited guests. People living near tanneries, slaughterhouses, or factories experience sensory challenges that make fainting seem like a perfectly reasonable coping mechanism. And then there were the hygiene misconceptions. Victorians sincerely believed that too much bathing weakened the body, stripped essential oils, or caused dangerous vulnerabilities. Many medical guides advise people to avoid washing their hair frequently, claiming it could destabilize the nerves. Others encouraged vigorous dry brushing, a gentle way of saying clean your skin without involving water because water is suspicious. Some even recommended sponge baths with vinegar or lavender water, which improved the aroma slightly but didn't address the deeper issue. Water was not their trusted friend. Public venues, too, carried their own olfactory challenges. Theatres grew hot and crowded. Church pews were filled with people who'd walked miles in heavy boots, and formal events involved tightly packed bodies in enclosed spaces. The scent of a ballroom by the midnight was a sensory gauntlet. Dancers twirled through an atmosphere dense with perfumes, sweat, wool, candles, and the unmistakable tang of exertion. For those with delicate constitutions or functional noses, remaining upright sometimes required heroic effort. Hospitals weren't immune either. Before proper sterilization and sanitation, medical environments could be overwhelming. Operating rooms were filled with lingering smells of disinfectants, bodily fluids, and unwashed instruments. Patients fainted, nurses fainted, sometimes even visitors fainted. It was a place where staying conscious felt like an optional challenge. But perhaps the most underestimated faint trigger of all was the simple, unavoidable truth. People were often packed together in spaces that did not accommodate their needs. Crowds formed everywhere, in markets, on public transport, in factories, on streets, in assembly halls. When large numbers of people gathered without hygiene infrastructure, the combined scent could hit with the subtlety of a battering ram. One deep inhale and your brain simply said, "We're done here." Yet for all this, Victorians trudged on, accustomed to odours so strong they could write autobiographies. Reformers eventually stepped in, cities improved sanitation, plumbing advanced, and people discovered the life-changing practice of regularly encountering soap. But during the height of the century, fainting wasn't just a reaction to shock or emotion. It was sometimes a desperate attempt to briefly escape the air. If you ever feel awkward about your family's weekend plans, take comfort in knowing that the Victorians sometimes treated public executions like social events. People gathered in crowds so large they blocked entire streets, climbed onto roofs, balanced on barrels, and even brought snacks. Nothing says family outing like accidentally passing out next to a pickpocket. But public executions weren't just spectacles, they were intense emotional storms that could overwhelm even the most stoic onlooker. And in a society famous for fainting over ankles and opera notes, witnessing the ultimate display of justice, or tragedy depending on your worldview, was enough to send people crumpling like paper fans. Crowds assembled early, often before dawn, to secure the best vantage points. The atmosphere buzzed with nervous tension. Some were there out of morbid curiosity, some for moral instruction, and others because they genuinely had nothing better to do on a Tuesday morning. Vendors wandered among the spectators selling pies, trinkets, and pamphlets describing the condemned's biography in dramatic, occasionally fictionalized detail. Children clutched their parents' hands, pickpockets drifted through the crowd like opportunistic shadows, and preachers used the occasion to remind everyone of life's fleeting nature. The event was part carnival, part moral lesson, part disaster waiting to happen, and fainting sat quietly in the audience, polishing its timing. For many, the emotional weight hit long before anything actually happened. Simply standing in a dense crowd of thousands created a pressure cooker of anticipation. People talked in low, tight voices about the crime and the punishment or the weather, trying to fill the nervous space. The sight of soldiers or constables moving into formation added to the tension. And when the execution scaffold finally came into view, wooden, stark familiar, something inside even the bravest spectators began to wobble. Knees softened, faces paled, fans fluttered with increasing urgency. But the real fainting began when the condemned appeared. The sight of a human being, frightened or calm, defiant or resigned, or walking toward their fate had a visceral impact. It didn't matter whether you believed justice was being served or a tragedy was unfolding. Seeing someone placed under the weight of finality could make your stomach dip like a carriage hitting a pothole. Some spectators fainted from empathy, some from horror, and others from sheer emotional overload. A few fainted because their imaginations had been sprinting laps since sunrise. The executioner's presence didn't help. Cloaked in grim authority, he represented both the law and the fear every Victorian carried about committing even the smallest misstep. His tools were symbols of power that made people suddenly hyper-aware of their own mortality. A glimpse of the noose or the blade, depending on the era and region, was enough to make certain onlookers sway. One spectator described fainting at the thought of the rope's shadow alone, which must have been very awkward for the rope. Then came the moment of silence. The crowd hushed. 1,000 breaths caught at once, waiting for the signal. In this tense stillness, fainting often hit its second wave. Standing in silence with anxiety hammering in your chest was a recipe for internal short-circuiting. People dropped suddenly, like dolls whose strings had been cut. Friends scrambled to catch them, strangers stepped aside awkwardly. Pickpockets took it as an opportunity to expand their workload. And when the execution finally occurred, the third wave arrived. The shock, whether expected or not, broke through the collective tension with a force that rolled through the spectators like wind. Some people fainted in fear, others fainted in awe. A few fainted simply because everyone around them was fainting, and they panicked. Victorian crowds were not known for handling emotions in measured ways. If one person screamed, others joined. If one person collapsed, some followed. If someone shouted, he moved. Chaos spread instantly. Public executions also had a strange effect on those who believed fainting was a respectable sign of moral refinement. Gentlewomen and gentlemen sometimes fainted because they felt it was the appropriate reaction, a way to show sensitivity and virtue. One might call it performative unconsciousness, a dramatic collapse to signal one's delicate constitution. After all, fainting strategically was practically a Victorian dialect. Interestingly, not all fainting came from emotion. Some came from logistics. Large crowds meant hours of standing in cramped conditions, often without food or water. People were packed shoulder to shoulder. The heat of the crowd, combined with the tension of the moment, created an atmosphere that could suffocate even the strongest constitution. Parents hoisted children on shoulders, creating an obstacle course that blocked airflow in unpredictable ways. People fainted here not from morality or horror, but from the simple, overwhelming reality of being crushed between strangers for too long. By the mid to late 19th century, public executions began to disappear as governments realized that maybe, just maybe, turning death into a community picnic wasn't the height of civilization. As they moved behind prison walls, fainting spells related to this diminished, though many Victorians still reported feeling woozy just reading newspaper descriptions afterward. Apparently, even imagination was enough to knock some people off their feet. Public executions left a strange legacy, a mix of moral panic, shared trauma, community bonding, and the uncomfortable reminder that the line between spectator and participant could feel disturbingly thin. And for those who attended, fainting wasn't just a physical reaction. It was a moment where the overwhelming spectacle of life and death blurred together and the body simply bowed out. When the first steam trains burst onto the scene, Victorians looked at them with the same mixture of awe and terror usually reserved for comets or suspiciously large vegetables. Travelling at 30 miles per hour, a speed that today wouldn't impress a distracted cyclist, felt like cosmic recklessness. The train wasn't fast, just faster than walking, which was apparently too much. People genuinely believed that moving at such velocity might melt their skin, scramble their thoughts, or cause their internal organs to rearrange themselves like poorly shelved books. And fainting became a standard reaction to simply being near one of these iron beasts, let alone climbing aboard. The first hurdle was the appearance of the trains themselves. Early locomotives hissed, clanked, roared and belched out smoke like dragons with respiratory issues. They were loud enough to shake windows and dramatic enough to make horses bolt in terror. To the Victorian mind, raised on pastoral landscapes, slow-paced travel and the gentle rhythms of horse hooves, trains were mechanical monsters. Standing near one as it prepared for departure was an emotional workout. The platform rumbled, steam spurted unpredictably, and the whistle pierced the air with a shriek that could have awakened the dead. For many spectators, just witnessing the machine come alive was enough to make the world tilt sideways as fainting politely entered the chat. Those brave enough to board weren't safe either. Early railway carriages were wooden, uninsulated boxes with hard seats and open windows that blasted riders with wind, cinders and existential dread. Passengers clutched the edges of their seats, eyes wide. Bracing for the moment, the train lurched forward with unexpected force, and when it did, rattling, shaking and screaming down the tracks, a number of Victorians did the only reasonable thing they could think of. They passed out. Not from pain or illness, but from the raw, unfiltered overstimulation of moving faster than any human had ever moved without falling off a cliff. Doctors did little to calm the hysteria. In fact, some contributed to it by publishing grim theories about what rapid travel could do to the human body. They warned that high speeds might stretch the brain, disturb the blood, or accelerate the pulse into dangerous irregularity. Certain experts insisted that passengers might lose their grip on reality or suffer mental instability from unnatural velocity. Imagine trying to enjoy a train ride while a doctor warns you that reality may detach from your body at any moment. No wonder people fainted. Their anxieties didn't just ride with them, they purchased first-class tickets. Newspapers amplified the panic by printing dramatic accounts of fainting passengers, swooning spectators, and terrified horses who reportedly tried to throw themselves into hedges rather than be anywhere near the tracks. One article insisted that the sheer speed of the train could separate the soul from the bones, which seems like the sort of phrase designed to make every nervous reader spontaneously lie down on the nearest fainting couch. Victorians, who already fainted at strong emotions, did not need help imagining their souls being left behind like forgotten luggage. Meanwhile, railway companies enthusiastically advertised the incredible speed and efficiency of train travel. The posters boasted about the train's ability to cover miles in minutes, though perhaps they should have added, "Please do not panic, you will not explode." People boarded cautiously, gripping the armrests as if they were about to be launched from a catapult. The first moments of motion were the worst. The sudden jerk forward, the blur of scenery, the roar of the engine. Even those determined to remain calm often found that calmness abandoning ship the moment the train picked up real speed. The fainting spells ranged from dramatic collapses to subtle swoons, where passengers simply slid down the seat like melting wax. Inside the carriages, people tried to cope with a variety of questionable strategies. Some closed their eyes, hoping that if they couldn't see the world rushing past at impossible speeds, their souls might remain appropriately attached. Others attempted to steady themselves by staring determinedly at their laps, as if their clothing could anchor them to reality. A few brave souls leaned out windows, only to be instantly assaulted by wind, soot and debris, occasionally inhaling so much cinder that fainting became a medically predictable outcome. Outside the trains, fainting was equally common among those who came to watch. Spectators lined the tracks to witness the marvel of modernity, expecting a graceful glide. Instead, the train roared past in a blur. Blast of wind knocking hats sideways and startling dogs into spontaneous existential crises. People gasped, children cried, some fainted outright, overwhelmed by the terrifying proof that the world was changing faster than their nerves could handle. Yet, amid the fears and collapses, fascination grew. As more people experienced train travel without liquefying or losing their souls, confidence increased. Eventually fainting tapered off, and though never completely disappeared, and the Victorian obsession with speed transformed into pride. What once made people swoon in terror soon became a symbol of progress, adventure, and the unstoppable march toward the future. Still, in those early days, fainting on or near a train wasn't just understandable. It was practically expected. The world was expanding, momentum was shifting, and the human imagination was struggling to keep pace with reality's new speed. Before the age of modern dentistry, with its numbing gels, local anaesthetics, ergonomic chairs, and polite reminders to floss, there existed a far more harrowing chapter of human history, getting your tooth pulled in the 1800s. Dentistry was basically medieval cosplay. There was no anaesthetic unless you count screaming, and fainting wasn't a surprising reaction. It was the body's polite attempt to avoid experiencing whatever was about to happen. In a century when people fainted from perfume, emotions, and flickering lamps, facing a dentist armed with pliers was more than enough to make consciousness optional. Dental care in the 19th century was a grim affair even before the extraction began. Oral hygiene was inconsistent at best, non-existent at worst. Sugar consumption was rising, toothpaste was in its experimental stage, toothbrush bristles fell out like autumn leaves, and many people considered rinsing with brandy a legitimate dental ritual. Cavities flourished, infections grew, teeth ached with the persistence of a tax collector. Eventually there came a moment when even the bravest soul realized that something had to be done, and that something usually meant removing the tooth entirely. Finding someone to extract it, however, was another challenge. Not all dentists were dentists. The profession was in its chaotic adolescence. Barbers, blacksmiths, travelling tooth specialists, and enthusiastic amateurs all advertised their services. You could get a shave, a haircut, and a tooth extraction in one appointment, because nothing says professionalism like mixing grooming with emergency oral surgery. Once the fateful appointment began, fainting was practically baked into the experience. The chair, if there was one, was upright, stiff, and deeply unsympathetic. Some dentists simply asked patients to sit on a stool or stand against a wall. The tools varied from respectable-looking forceps to instruments that resembled hardware scavenged from a barn. Nothing shined because nothing had been sterilised. The best you could hope for was that the tools were wiped between uses. The dentist's preparation wasn't much more comforting. Some would give you a cloth to bite down on. Others offered alcohol, the original liquid courage, an unofficial painkiller of the pre-anaesthetic era. A generous practitioner might advise you to brace yourself. Then the procedure began, usually with the dentist planting a foot firmly against your chest or shoulder for leverage, a detail rarely shown in historical dramas, but very common in actual Victorian dentistry. Then came the pulling. Teeth in the 1800s did not quietly cooperate. They cracked, splintered, resisted, and lodged themselves deep in inflamed gums like stubborn tenants refusing to vacate. The dentist tugged, twisted, and yanked with the determination of someone attempting to uproot a small tree. The patient held onto the chair, the wall, or sometimes the nearest unfortunate bystander. Pain shot upward through the jaw, into the skull, and down the spine with enough force to make people reconsider every life choice that had led them to this moment. Many individuals fainted during the extraction, either from the pain itself or from the shock of anticipation. Some collapsed before the first touch of the instrument. Their imagination simply cut the power early. Others fainted mid-procedure, head rolling back dramatically as their body declared a temporary shutdown. And a select few regained consciousness, only to faint again when informed the tooth had broken and the dentist had to go back in law. Crowds often witnessed the procedure. Travelling tooth pullers performed in marketplaces, pulling teeth as public demonstrations of skill. People gathered to watch in the same spirit they attended fireworks or street performances. The moment a stubborn molar finally popped free, the crowd applauded. The patient often fainted. Occasionally the onlookers fainted too. It was communal dentistry in the least comforting sense imaginable. Even aristocrats weren't spared. Wealth simply meant your dentist had nicer clothes, a dedicated room, and tools that were less rusty. But the pain was the same. Letters and diaries from the era are filled with dramatic entries about tooth extractions, describing everything from fiery agony to a sensation of one's skull being pulled from within. Some compared it to torture. Others simply stopped writing mid-sentence, which tells you everything. After the extraction, fainting continued to be an issue. Blood loss, shock, infections, and the lingering dizziness of having survived something equivalent to a duel contributed to sudden collapses long after the dentist cheerfully declared the procedure a success. Patients stumbled home wrapped in shawls, clutching their jaw like wounded soldiers. Some fainted the moment they crossed the threshold of their own house, finally safe enough to let their body panic. Yet, with all the suffering, there existed a strange pride in surviving a dental extraction without anesthesia. It was considered a mark of toughness, a rite of passage. Newspapers printed brave accounts of people who endured particularly difficult extractions, as if they had achieved heroic feats. Even children were sometimes praised for their bravery, though children also fainted frequently, usually because they were smaller and therefore ran out of courage faster. The arrival of anesthesia in the late 19th century changed everything. Ether and chloroform slowly took over, turning dentistry from a public hazard into a survivable medical procedure. But before that revolution arrived, fainting was a common, expected, almost comforting part of the process. The brief, merciful blackout amidst the chaos. Science in the 19th century was a thrilling spectacle, part discovery, part performance, part, please step back, we have no idea what this will do. Public demonstrations drew enormous crowds eager to witness the wonders of progress. Yet the line between enlightenment and panic was thin. Science said, trust me, and people fainted instead. Electricity, combustion, magnetism, chemistry, all new, all unpredictable, all capable of causing sudden collapses in audiences who had only recently adjusted to the idea that trains wouldn't kill them at 30 miles per hour. If the Victorian public had one collective hobby, it was fainting at things they didn't fully understand, and scientific demonstrations offered them more opportunities than a fainting couch could handle. Electricity was the biggest crowd pleaser and the biggest culprit. Early electrical demonstrations involved devices that hummed, crackled, and sparked with theatrical enthusiasm. Audiences watched as scientists touched metal rods, turned cranks, and produced electrical arcs that lit the room with ghostly flashes. Even without being shocked, spectators often felt their nerves jump in sympathy. Electricity was still mysterious enough that people weren't entirely convinced it wasn't alive. When a scientist summoned a sudden spark, the kind that leapt dramatically across a gap, the noise alone could make someone's heart skip a beat and their stability skip entirely. People fainted simply from the thrill or the fear that electricity might escape the machine and start choosing victims. Then came the demonstrations where volunteers were invited on stage to experience mild electric shocks. Victorians, raised on cautionary tales about invisible forces, approached these invitations with the same energy as someone being asked to pet a dragon. Those who agreed often gripped the rod, felt the buzz travel through their arm, and fainted backward before the scientist could proudly say, "Notice how harmless this is." Even those in the audience sometimes fainted in empathy, convinced they had just witnessed a man being struck by lightning indoors. Electricity's reputation as a mysterious force capable of both illuminating cities and obliterating trees did not help calm the spectators' imaginations. Chemical demonstrations were equally dramatic. Scientists mixed substances in beakers and vials, swirling liquids with confidence that didn't always match the experiment's stability. Sometimes a mixture bubbled gently, producing satisfying reactions that delighted spectators. Other times it hissed ominously, emitted a strange smell, or suddenly produced coloured smoke that drifted into the crowd like a slow-moving omen. People fainted at the first whiff, convinced the vapours were toxic, and to be fair, sometimes they were. Chemistry in the 19th century was still a bit of a guessing game. Something that looked like harmless steam might be an unintended side effect of substances reacting in ways the scientist had not entirely predicted. Occasionally, a demonstration erupted into a small explosion, nothing catastrophic, but loud enough to rattle nerves and send nearby onlookers into elegant freefall. Eyewitness accounts describe people dropping to the ground like startled dominoes. The scientist would cough politely, wave the smoke away, and continue as if minor explosions were merely part of the show. To the audience, however, the shockwave was enough to summon dizzy spells, rapid pulses, and impromptu unconsciousness. Magnetism also caused its fair share of fainting spells. Scientists displayed the mysterious power of magnets by moving metal objects without touching them, or by demonstrating magnetic fields with iron filings dancing in eerie formations. Victorians were enchanted and unnerved. Some fainted because they believed invisible forces were swirling around them, manipulating objects in the room. Others fainted out of moral panic, convinced they were witnessing something bordering on supernatural interference. A few simply fainted because they were overwhelmed by trying to understand it at all. Even demonstrations involving air pressure, sound waves, or early mechanical devices sparked chaos. One popular demonstration involved placing a marshmallow-like object under a vacuum bell jar, causing it to expand dramatically. People gasped. Some fainted. One woman reportedly fainted because she believed her own body might expand in the same manner if exposed to forceful air manipulation. Another demonstration involving resonance used tuning forks to create invisible vibrations that shattered glass, and occasionally shattered the confidence of everyone in the audience. The sudden breaking sound, combined with the idea that invisible waves could cause destruction, sent more than a few spectators into dramatic collapse. Scientific lectures, meant to be informative, often turned into fainting festivals halfway through. As soon as a demonstration began to behave abnormally, glowing brighter than expected, producing an unexpected sound, or making an object move in a surprising way, someone's nervous system would throw in the towels. The poor lecturer would pause as ushers carried out yet another unconscious attendee, then continue as though fainting was simply one of the standard reactions to learning. But fainting wasn't always from fear. Some Victorians fainted because science made them profoundly excited. They were thrilled by progress, moved by discovery, overwhelmed by the idea that human knowledge was expanding into realms once thought impossible. Particularly moving demonstration and, say, an early electric light brilliantly illuminating a dark hall could cause someone to faint from sheer emotion, like a person confronted with a miracle. In the end, scientific demonstrations weren't dangerous because of the experiments themselves. Well, not only because of the experiments. They were dangerous because they pushed Victorians beyond the emotional boundaries they'd inherited from centuries of slower, quieter living. Electricity, chemistry, magnetism, and mechanical innovation tugged at their sense of the possible, and sometimes that tug was simply too strong to remain conscious. Victorians loved ghosts with the same intensity that modern audiences love true crime podcasts, except their fascination came with higher risks of fainting, shrieking, and accidentally knocking over the nearest table. Spiritualism swept through the 19th century like a fashionable storm, promising contact with the dead, answers from beyond, and emotional closure wrapped in candlelight. In reality, half the ghosts were just men in bedsheets earning side income. but the belief was strong, the atmosphere was intense, and the fainting spells came fast and frequent. Seances were social events as much as spiritual rituals. People gathered in darkened parlours, joining hands around tables polished to a reflective shine. Curtains were drawn, lamps dimmed, and every creak in the house suddenly became meaningful. The air grew thick with anticipation, perfume, and the unmistakable nervousness of Victorians who were always one dramatic moment away from losing consciousness. Someone might whisper a prayer, someone else might stifle a gasp, and everyone waited for something and anything to happen. The fainting often began before the séance even started. The moment the room went dark, imaginations took flight. Shadows loomed larger, the atmosphere felt heavier, and people became aware of how loudly their hearts were beating. A single cough could send a tremor through the entire group, a shifting chair could tighten every spine, and all it took was one person whispering, "Did you feel that?" for someone else to faint immediately. Darkness was fuel for Victorian nerves, and séances made generous use of it. Mediums, the stars of the spiritual show, knew exactly how to work a crowd. Some performed with sincerity, others with flair, and many with techniques that would make a stage magician applaud. They tapped on furniture, rustled clothing, and manipulated hidden wires to make objects move. They blew gently to create cold breezes, slipped their feet from their shoes to levitate, or used luminous paint to create floating ghostly shapes. These tricks weren't always subtle, but they didn't need to be. Séances relied less on illusion and more on atmosphere. And atmosphere was something Victorians were terrifyingly susceptible to. Once the table began to tilt, either because the medium pushed it with their knee, or because participants were unconsciously leaning into the experience, fainting became almost guaranteed. A woman might gasp, clutch her chest, and collapse into her neighbour's lap. A man might sway, confident he had felt a spirit brush against his sleeve, then slide sideways like a collapsing bookshelf. Even those who didn't faint outright often found themselves dizzy, breathless, or trembling so hard they might as well have fainted and gotten it over with. Some séances featured spirit voices produced by mediums using hidden horns or clever ventriloquism. In the dim room, the disembodied whispers seemed unexplainable, and Victorians, who already believed their hallways might house supernatural guests, didn't stand a chance. One unexpected whisper, and half the attendees dropped like petals in a sudden breeze. Some fainted in fear, others in awe, and a few fainted simply because they thought fainting was the proper emotional response to ghostly communication. The appearance of ghostly figures caused the most dramatic outcomes. Sometimes a medium's assistant, draped in flowing fabric, face powdered, eyes wide, would glide into view just as the candles flickered. Even the most skeptical participants couldn't stop the instinctive check that rocketed through the room. People fainted backward, forward, diagonally, and occasionally onto the séance table itself. The medium, maintaining an air of serene mystery, would claim the fainting was proof that the spirits were near. In reality, it was proof that Victorian adrenaline had a low tolerance for surprise. Ghost hoaxes outside formal séances created similar reactions. Travelling performers staged haunted exhibitions using hidden panels, smoke and mirrors to create apparitions. Some households hosted casual ghost-inviting experiments among friends, dimming lamps, reciting incantations from questionable books, and then screaming when someone's cat brushed against an ankle in the dark. Fake haunted houses, curated illusions, and trick photography all played into the craze. Spectators fainted at stage ghosts, lantern projections, and even newspaper illustrations depicting spirits with dramatic flair. The line between imagination and reality blurred easily, when fainting was always waiting just around the corner. But fainting wasn't always fear-driven. Some Victorians fainted out of excitement or emotional vulnerability. Spiritualism offered comfort to those grieving loved ones. The idea of hearing from a departed friend or parent was overwhelming. When mediums delivered messages, often vague enough to apply to anyone, people collapsed from the emotional weight. Tears flowed, hands shook, Bodies gave out under the pressure of hope colliding with uncertainty. There were also those who fainted because they believed fainting made the experience more legitimate. Being overcome by the spirit world was a badge of sensitivity, refinement, and moral attunement. A dramatic swoon signalled that one had a delicate connection to the beyond, or at least a flair for theatrics. Mediums encouraged this interpretation, praising those who fainted as channels or receptive souls, which only encouraged further collapses in future gatherings. Eventually, many ghost hoaxes were exposed, and spiritualism became a little less fashionable, but fainting never fully left the seances. Because whether the phenomenon was real or not, the emotional cocktail of darkness, expectation and mystery was strong enough to send anyone's nerves spiralling. Long before medical schools had clean lecture halls, digital diagrams, and reassuring instructors who said things like, "Don't worry, you'll get used to it," there were 19th century anatomy textbooks. Thick, heavy tomes filled with illustrations so detailed they made even the bravest aspiring doctors reconsider every decision that led them to that moment. Students fainted at diagrams that looked like someone peeled a fruit wrong. One look at a cross-section, and future doctors reconsidered everything. If fainting had prerequisites, anatomy class would have fulfilled all of them. These textbooks didn't ease readers in gently. They didn't start with cheerful diagrams of "here's a friendly rib" or "meet your organs." They dove straight into the deep end, presenting organs, tissues, muscles, and nerves with the kind of accuracy only possible when the illustrator spent several hours staring into an open cadaver while questioning their own life choices. Every sheet of parchment bore a new horror. Intricate sketches of sinew, bone, vessels branching like confused tree roots, and cross-sections so precise they resembled botanical illustrations from a different dimension. It's one thing to conceptualize what goes on beneath your own skin, it's another to open a book and see it rendered with artistic devotion. For many medical students, their first encounter with these drawings came with the same energy as opening a cursed tome in a Gothic novel. The experience usually went something like this. They sat confidently at their desks, flipped the page, paused, felt their stomach drop into their shoes, and then fainted with the determination of someone falling into a soft bed after a long day. The illustrations didn't shy away from anything. Nerves splayed out like tangled yarn, organs sliced open with unsettling enthusiasm, and skin removed just enough to reveal the intricate machinery underneath. Students braced themselves for knowledge and instead got hit with the visual equivalent of a dramatic plot twist. Victorian sensibilities didn't help. This was a society where many people fainted at the idea of bodily functions, disliked discussing internal anatomy, and preferred to imagine the human body as a polite, well-behaved vessel containing only moral fibre and tea. Confronting a drawing of dissected tissue was like discovering your beloved grandmother had been moonlighting as a knife juggler. The contrast between societal modesty and surgical reality was enough to destabilize even the sturdiest constitution. Anatomy classrooms made the experience even more intense. Picture a room filled with students hunched over these books, each one trying desperately to maintain composure while their textbooks displayed cross-sections of limbs that looked disturbingly familiar. Any hint of nausea spread like wildfire. One student turned pale, another wobbled, and then, like synchronized swimmers of doom, they toppled one after another. Professors grew so accustomed to this chain reaction that they kept smelling salts on hand the way modern teachers keep extra pencils. The illustrations themselves were masterpieces of precision. Artists of the era prided themselves on capturing every detail, from the delicate striations of muscle to the fine branching of veins. Many worked directly in dissecting rooms, sketching while medical students hovered nearby in barely controlled panic. Some artists became so celebrated for their anatomical skill that their drawings outlived the very theories they illustrated. But their realism came with a price. Every new textbook edition seemed determined to be more detailed than the last. What one generation of students fainted over, the next generation fainted over harder. Not all illustrations were equally terrifying, of course. Some focused on bones, which were comparatively calm and rarely caused fainting unless the angle was particularly dramatic. But the drawings that featured organs in cross-section or flayed muscles arranged like decorative ribbons, those were the true culprits. They were the ones that made students drop their books, clutch their heads, and mutter things like, "Didn't realise there were that many layers." The idea of peeling anything in layers was alarming enough. Realising you had layers was an emotional ambush. Textbooks also contained detailed depictions of diseases and deformities, drawn with scientific accuracy but emotional disregard. For students who had only glimpsed sickness from the outside, these illustrations felt like shock revelations, a behind-the-scenes look no one had emotionally prepared them for. Inflamed tissues, ulcerated organs, twisted bones, the drawings conveyed the full force of medical reality without anesthesia, gloves, or filters. Fainting wasn't just expected, it was practically a rite of passage. There were even documented cases of students fainting before they reached the end of the first chapter. Professors described them folding over their desks like neglected marionettes. Some fainted while attempting to memorize diagrams, forehead hitting the page in dramatic surrender. A few insisted on studying only outdoors, claiming the fresh air gave them the strength to endure the liver illustrations. Others tried covering the more alarming parts of the drawings with pieces of paper, treating anatomy study like a strategic battle between curiosity and self-preservation. Over time, students adjusted, or at least built tolerance through repeated exposure, fainting less frequently as their shock transformed into fascination. Soon the diagrams that once made them swoon became vital learning tools, guiding them through dissections, surgeries, and medical understanding. But in those early encounters, when the human body suddenly revealed its secrets with too much honesty, fainting remained the body's favourite escape plan. Victorian fashion was a battlefield disguised in ribbons, feathers, and polished elegance, and the casualties were usually the wearers themselves, who discovered that looking fashionable was easy, staying conscious was the hard part. In an era obsessed with appearances, accessories weren't just decorative, they were architectural feats that pushed the limits of anatomy, patience, and blood flow. Hats towered like monuments, gloves squeezed fingers until they tingled, and cravats wrapped necks with the affectionate pressure of a determined boa constrictor. Fainting was less of an accident and more of a stylistic consequence. Start with the hats, the colossal gravity-defying creations that strutted across Victorian society. Women wore hats so large they created their own weather systems, adorned with feathers, artificial flowers, stuffed birds, yes, actual stuffed birds, lace, ribbons, and whatever else seemed sufficiently dramatic. These were not lightweight accessories. They were structural commitments. Some hats weighed several pounds, pinning hair to scalps with the force of a small anvil. A slight breeze could tip one forward, pulling the head with it. Neck muscles strained, posture wavered, and the pressure mixed with summer heat became the perfect recipe for fainting in spectacular fashion. And those weren't even the worst offenders. Certain hats were secured with tight bands or pins that dug into the scalp with ruthless efficiency. Women stood elegantly in parlours while tiny metal prongs attempted to pierce the skull. The pain built slowly, like a headache with ambition, combined with the effort of holding one's head perfectly still because God forbid a plume droop or a ribbon shift. Some women found themselves swaying before collapsing into the nearest chair, sofa, or unsuspecting acquaintance. A charming hat could open doors socially, but it often closed off blood supply physically. Men fared no better with their fashion accessories. The cravat, a long strip of fabric wrapped around the neck, was a proud symbol of refinement, dignity, and unconsciousness waiting to happen. A well-tied cravat had to be snug, symmetrical, and secure, which often meant tightening it until turning the head felt like negotiating with a stiff collar. Some manuals even recommended tightening it enough to create a pleasing resistance. The only thing it resisted was circulation. Many gentlemen walked around feeling mildly strangled, which led to dizziness, shallow breathing, and the eventual, inevitable faint when they bowed too deeply or turned their heads too quickly. The Victorian glove industry also contributed generously to the national fainting statistics. Gloves were essential for propriety. Hands were not meant to be seen in their natural scandalous state, but fashionable gloves fit so tightly they were practically corsets for fingers. Ladies wore gloves so snug that putting them on required talcum powder, prayer, and occasionally a friend to tug from the other side. Once on, the gloves pressed the skin, restricted hand movement, and, in extreme cases, reduced blood flow to the point of tingling or numbness. Removing them could be an ordeal so dramatic it resembled shedding a snake's skin. A woman attending a long evening event might feel the faintness creep in as her hands grew colder and the rest of her body decided to join in sympathy. Footwear also joined the battle. Women's boots were fashionable yet merciless, squeezing toes into elegant shapes that feet never agreed to. Tight laces cut into ankles, heels forced weight unnaturally forward, and stockings added layers of friction that encouraged the wearer to wobble like a puppet with cut strings. Walking long distances became a feat of endurance. Standing still became a test of circulation. Fainting outdoors, fainting in carriages, fainting mid-stride, all perfectly normal experiences for anyone whose feet had decided, without consent, to stop participating in the situation. Even jewellery contributed to collapses. Heavy brooches pinned to delicate fabrics dragged clothing downward, creating discomfort and pressure. Weighty necklaces tugged at the neck until the wearer felt a mix of elegance and mild strangulation. Earrings dangled like miniature anchors, bracelets cut into skin. Fashion demanded layers of ornamentation, and each addition brought the wearer one step closer to an evening spent either fanning themselves frantically or attempting not to slump onto the dinner table. But perhaps the most underrated accessory disaster was the combination of everything at once. The hat, the gloves, the cravat or high collar, the boots, the jewellery, the multiple layers of fabric, each piece demanding its own bit of oxygen, blood flow and posture. A perfectly dressed Victorian didn't just look composed, they were actively battling gravity, circulation, and endurance while pretending it was effortless. Hosts and guests made polite conversation while dealing with tingling fingers, stiff necks, and hats that threatened to topple them whenever they nodded. Fainting was often the body's final act of rebellion, a dramatic but understandable surrender. One can almost imagine the internal monologue of a well-dressed Victorian. I will look splendid. I will stand tall. Why is the room spinning? Ah yes, the gloves have suffocated my hands. The cravat is cutting off my thoughts. And the hat. Oh dear, the hat. And then, predictably, collapse. Even as fashion evolved, the commitment to discomfort persisted. New accessories arrived, old ones transformed, but the goal remained the same: beauty at any cost, occasionally including consciousness. Victorians accepted fainting as a normal, even refined consequence of style. Staying awake was practical, fainting was fashionable. When photography first appeared in the 19th century, people didn't react with smiles, curiosity, or enthusiasm. They reacted the same way they reacted to most new technologies of the era, with confusion, dread, spiritual panic, and occasional horizontalness. Say cheese, and by cheese we mean goodbye to your consciousness. Early cameras didn't just challenge Victorian beliefs, they startled them so thoroughly that fainting became a reasonable response to the idea that a mysterious box might be able to swallow your soul whole. To start, early cameras were not cute little rectangles you slipped into a pocket. They were towering contraptions mounted on tripods, draped in dark cloth, and operated by photographers who moved like priests preparing for ritual sacrifice. People watching the process saw the photographer disappear under a hood, adjust knobs and levers that clicked ominously, then emerge again with a seriousness usually reserved for funerals. The whole setup looked like an elaborate attempt to communicate with otherworldly forces, and not everyone was convinced the forces were friendly. The biggest fear, that being photographed meant surrendering something spiritual. Victorian society was already steeped in ghost stories, seances, and lingering superstitions. The idea that a machine could permanently capture the way someone looked felt eerily too close to capturing something deeper. Rumours circulated that photographs trapped the essence of a person, a fragment of their soul, leaving them spiritually weakened, emotionally vulnerable, or partially missing. Some fainted the moment the camera lens pointed at them, convinced they were being spiritually mugged. Even those brave enough to pose didn't feel entirely safe. Early photographs required long exposure times, meaning people had to sit perfectly still while staring into a dark, unblinking lens that resembled a mechanical eye. They held their breath, steadied their posture, and prayed silently that whatever the camera took, it wouldn't be their immortal essence. As the seconds dragged on, dizziness crept in. Holding an expression without movement was physically demanding. Add the psychological pressure of believing your eternal fate depended on not blinking, and fainting became the natural conclusion. Then came the flash. Early photographic flashes were chaotic demonstrations involving magnesium powder ignited into a brilliant blast of light. The effect was closer to a lightning strike than a pleasant studio flash. It illuminated the room with a sudden burst so bright and startling that even photographers sometimes jumped back. Spectators screamed, gasped, or stumbled. Sitters fainted from the shock, convinced they had just witnessed the heavens opening or their soul exiting through sheer force. Some fainted because they thought the flash was a small explosion, which in fairness it sometimes was. Onlookers added to the fainting chaos. Photography studios attracted curious crowds who couldn't resist peeking inside to watch the magic unfold. But watching someone remain still through a long exposure was oddly nerve-wracking. People whispered theories, clutched each other's arms, or backed away when the flash erupted. Some fainted simply from witnessing the process, feeling their nerves fray at the idea that a ghostly imprint had just been made on a piece of metal or paper. The resulting image caused its own spectrum of faint-worthy reactions. Early photographs looked strange. Stiff poses, unsmiling faces, eyes occasionally appearing too reflective or shadowed. People didn't know how to interpret these ghost-like portraits of themselves or others. Seeing one's own image, perfectly preserved, eerily lifelike, was overwhelming. Some feared it was an omen, a warning, or a glimpse of how they might appear in death. Others fainted from shock at how severe they looked. After all, no one in early photography smiled, and many interpreted their own stern expressions as signs of illness, moral failing, or supernatural interference. Family members fainted too, often when shown images of relatives who had passed away. Post-mortem photography, though common, led to emotional meltdowns when grief-stricken relatives saw their loved ones posed in lifelike form. These images felt too real, too present, too haunting. For some, it brought closure. For others, the shock was so intense that consciousness briefly evacuated the premises. Photographers did little to reassure their clients. Many embraced the mystique, using dramatic backdrops, heavy curtains, or shadowed lighting that made the experience feel even more otherworldly. Some studios displayed collections of spirit photographs, doctored images that appeared to show faint ghostly figures hovering near the sitter. These became wildly popular, further convincing Victorians that cameras meddled with realms best left alone. Clients who believed the spirits were real sometimes fainted the moment the final image was revealed, certain they had been accompanied by a ghost all along. Even skeptics weren't immune to fainting. Early amateur photography involved unpredictable chemicals, fragile plates, and equipment prone to collapsing, leaking, or catching fire. People fainted from chemical fumes, from failed experiments, or from surprise when an image unexpectedly developed with bizarre distortions that looked supernatural. Everything about photography felt experimental, volatile, and strangely magical. Yet as time passed, photography became a familiar marvel. The fainting subsided as people realized their souls remained intact, exposures shortened, and flashes became less explosive. But in those early years, photography didn't just open a new window into reality, it slammed Victorians with revelations they weren't prepared to handle, their own image preserved forever, staring back at them with uncanny stillness. When hot air balloons first drifted into the public imagination, people didn't see gentle adventure, floating tranquility, or dreamy escapes above the earth. They saw danger. They saw chaos. They saw a giant fabric creature rising into the heavens like it had made a pact with forces better left unmentioned. The idea of floating wasn't charming, it was witchcraft, but airborne. And fainting? Oh, fainting came easy. For spectators and riders alike, balloon ascents were nerve-shattering spectacles, equal parts awe, terror, and I'm going to lie down now. The very sight of a balloon being inflated was enough to send some Victorians wobbling. Inflation wasn't a quiet, gentle process. It involved fire, shouting, billowing canvas, and the kind of heat that made the air shimmer. Great sheets of fabric rose and flapped like a mythical beast awakening from slumber. Crowds gathered in enormous numbers to watch these early ascents, pressing together for a glimpse. People gasped, clutched each other's sleeves, whispered prayers, or stood frozen as the balloon slowly grew in size. Some swooned long before the balloon ever left the ground, overwhelmed by the sheer drama of watching a machine inflate into something too big, too alive, too unfamiliar. And then came the moment the balloon actually lifted. The basket trembled. The rope strained. The balloon pulled upward, light and monstrous at the same time. People screamed, some cried, a few fainted instantly, rocking sideways into the nearest bystander like startled domino tiles. To spectators convinced the sky was meant only for birds and angels, watching a human rise off the earth felt like witnessing a violation of natural law. If gravity was so easily ignored, what else might go wrong? What if the balloon didn't stop rising? What if the rider drifted into space? What if the clouds were portals? Victorians didn't know, and their imaginations rarely erred on the side of calm. The riders themselves didn't always fare better. Some were adventurers committed to bold exploration. Others were scientists determined to measure the atmosphere or test theories. But many were terrified amateurs, convinced to ride by promises of fame, curiosity, or the pressure of friends who thought ballooning sounded like a fun afternoon activity. Once the ground began shrinking beneath them, adrenaline and panic took hold. Riders clung to the edge of the wicker basket, knuckles white, breath thin. Some fainted mid-ascent, collapsing into the bottom of the basket while the balloon continued upward with a leisurely disregard for its unconscious passenger. Even brave pilots suffered moments of dizziness. Balloons swayed unpredictably, moved with the wind's moods, and offered no steering mechanism beyond hope. Gusts pushed them sideways, lurches made the basket tilt, the ground wobbled like an unsteady drawing. Up in the open sky, with nothing but a flame and fabric keeping you afloat, fainting became an entirely reasonable coping mechanism. Some pilots regained consciousness only to faint again when they realized how high they'd become. Crowds fainted even harder when the balloon reached significant altitude. Early ascents often drew thousands who stared upward, shading their eyes with gloved hands as the balloon disappeared into clouds. The thought of a human drifting so far from safety shook delicate nerves. It wasn't uncommon for spectators to faint simply because they imagined themselves in the basket. One minute you're watching a balloon rise, the next, your brain is staging a personal reenactment of the journey, complete with the emotional vertigo required to knock you flat on your back. And landings? Landings were an entire fainting festival of their own. Balloons rarely descended gracefully. They crashed into trees, bounced across fields, landed in lakes, or dragged the basket sideways across the ground. Spectators fainted at the sight. Farmers fainted when the balloon dropped unexpectedly onto their property. Sometimes entire villages fainted collectively when a balloon landed nearby, convinced that a celestial omen, a supernatural creature, or perhaps a misdirected messenger from heaven had come calling. One can hardly blame them. If a giant fabric apparition fell from the sky today, social media would implode. Balloon ascents also attracted a reputation for being morally suspicious. Some critics whispered that humans were never meant to tamper with the heavens, Others insisted that riders risked losing their souls by ascending too close to regions reserved for divine company. Religious anxiety gave fainting an extra boost. People collapsed under the weight of seeing something they believed blurred the boundary between earthly existence and celestial domains. And if the idea of ballooning didn't faint you, the accidents might. Early balloon flights occasionally burst into flames, tipped over, collided with rooftops, or vanished entirely. Newspapers published dramatic accounts of missing aeronauts drifting into unknown skies, never seen again. Readers fainted mid-article, clutching the paper like a tragic letter from a ghost. Stories of daring rescues, perilous journeys, and miraculous survivals thrilled the Victorian imagination, while also pushing it to its fainting limits. But balloon ascents weren't only about fear. Some fainted from exhilaration, from the emotional intensity of watching humanity rise into a world previously reserved for dreams. The idea that people could fly, even if it was more wobbling than soaring, was profoundly moving. It shook their conception of human possibility. It made them dizzy, literally. As ballooning grew more common, the fainting spells became less frequent, replaced by fascination and eventually enthusiasm. But in those early days, when the sky was still considered a sacred or forbidden place, seeing a giant flaming bag of air lift someone from the ground was enough to make even the bravest Victorian swoon. Victorian opera houses were monuments to elegance, towering balconies, glittering chandeliers, velvet curtains heavy enough to crush a small horse. Everything about them screamed sophistication. Everything except the airflow. Beauty, glamour, and collapsing patrons. Nothing boosts ticket sales like the possibility of fainting into a stranger's lap. If you entered an opera house in the 19th century, you weren't just attending a performance. You were entering a slow-simmering pressure cooker of sound, heat, perfume, and minimal oxygen, all wrapped in brocade and architectural pride. The experience began the moment you stepped inside. Opera houses were designed to impress, to overwhelm the senses before the music even started. Plush seats, gilded balconies, painted ceilings, they dazzle the eye while quietly sabotaging the respiratory system. Those magnificent draperies, dust traps, those luxurious carpets, heat blankets, those towering columns, decorative obstacles blocking the last remaining breeze that might have wandered in accidentally. The air inside wasn't just warm, it was committed. It clung to every surface, refusing to rise, fall, or move. Patrons described it as stuffy, but that word doesn't capture the full experience. Stuffy suggests inconvenience. This was more like breathing warm custard, and the crowds did not help. People packed themselves shoulder to shoulder, layer upon layer of clothing, creating a collective insulation that turned the auditorium into a vast, shared sauna. Gentlemen wore heavy coats and tightly knotted cravats. Ladies wore gowns with multiple petticoats, corsets, and elaborate accessories. Each person generated enough heat to qualify as a small furnace. Multiply this by several hundred, and the opera house didn't so much host audiences as roast them gently. Add perfume to the mix. Victorians loved strong scents, and many saw the opera as the perfect opportunity to deploy their most potent fragrances. The air inside became a swirling cloud of rose, jasmine, lavender, patchouli, musk, and whatever unregulated concoction someone had dabbed behind their ears. Combined with heat, the scents intensified, filling the hall like aromatic fog. Those with delicate nerves often found their vision blurring before the overture even began. The lighting added another layer of danger. Before electric bulbs, opera houses used gaslight, hundreds of flame-powered fixtures lining balconies and illuminating chandeliers. Gas lamps burned hot, contributing generously to the already oppressive temperature. Worse, they consumed oxygen while releasing fumes that floated invisibly through the audience. Spectators inhaled a mix of warm air, perfume vapour, sweat, and the subtle tang of gas. Even without fainting tendencies, this was a combination likely to make your head spin. For Victorians who fainted if a flower looked at them too sternly, It was simply catastrophic. Once the performance began, the situation grew more intense. Opera was an emotional sledgehammer, glorious, dramatic, overwhelming. When a soprano delivered a soaring aria or a tenor unleashed heart-wrenching passion, audiences weren't simply listening. They were feeling the vibrations ripple through their rib cages, stirring their already fragile equilibrium. A few dramatic notes could push someone teetering on the edge into full collapse. One moment they were enjoying the music, the next, their body declared, "I'm done," and down they went. And the fainting patterns were fascinatingly predictable. The first wave usually struck during the opening act as the temperature rose. Small thuds echoed through the audience as bodies slumped gracelessly into chairs. Ushers moved down aisles with the brisk determination of battlefield medics, fanning unconscious patrons and dragging them quietly toward cooler corridors. The second wave tended to follow emotional crescendos, big arias, tragic revelations, dramatic confrontations. The music soared, the emotions surged, the heat spiked, and suddenly 2 or 3 heads dipped backward in near-perfect synchrony. The third wave belonged to intermissions, when patrons rose to stretch their legs and discovered that standing after sitting in hot, oxygen-depleted air was a gamble. People fainted while attempting to leave their seats. They fainted while descending staircases. They fainted while waiting in long lines for refreshments. Some fainted in the lobby and revived only to faint again when they realised they were blocking traffic. And this wasn't just the audience. Performers fainted too, singing through long acts under scorching stage lights while wearing heavy costumes made fainting nearly inevitable. Sopranos in multi-layered gowns collapsed mid-note. Tenors crumpled after delivering emotional finales. Dancers succumbed backstage between scenes. Stagehands carried smelling salts the way modern crews carry bottled water. Opera houses of the era became infamous for fainting incidents, so much so that attending one practically required a mental agreement to possibly leave horizontally. Newspapers described fainting in polite tones, calling it a temporary indisposition brought on by the warmth of the hall, while ignoring the fact that some nights more people fainted than applauded. But for Victorians, fainting was not a deterrent. It was tradition, spectacle, a sign they had truly felt the art. Opera wasn't just heard, it was survived. You didn't merely attend a performance, you endured it like a cultural rite, emerging afterward flushed, breathless, emotionally moved, and occasionally carried out by a friend. In the 19th century, books didn't just entertain, they threatened civilization, frayed nerves, corrupted youth, and, if the critics were to be believed, caused fainting fits powerful enough to rearrange furniture. Some novels were accused of exciting the nerves too much. One dramatic sentence and boom, literary-induced floor nap. It wasn't just the act of reading that worried people. It was the terrifying idea that imagination itself could run wild, seize the body and send it tumbling onto the nearest rug. To understand this panic, you have to picture Victorian society's delicate relationship with emotion. This was an era where public restraint was considered a virtue, where proper behaviour mattered more than personal comfort, and where admitting intense feelings was practically a breach of etiquette. Now imagine this same society suddenly flooded with novels bursting at the seams with romance, suspense, drama, danger, intrigue and characters kissing, without first submitting an official request to do so. Books weren't just stories, they were emotional roller coasters disguised as paper. The panic started in drawing rooms, where respectable families muttered worriedly over serialized novels that left readers breathless. Some women reportedly fainted while reading scenes of passion or peril, their imaginations galloping faster than their bodies could manage. Critics scolded novelists for creating undue excitement, blaming books for elevated heart rates, emotional swelling and spontaneous swoons. If a heroine clasped her hands too passionately, or a villain lurked in too shadowy a hallway, someone's nerves were bound to malfunction. Libraries and literary societies added fuel to the panic by issuing stern warnings about the dangers of reading too much fiction. They argued that novels weakened moral fibre, distracted from practical responsibilities, and stimulated the imagination until it misbehaved. There were even claims that certain chapters should be consumed in moderation, as if novels, like brandy, might require rationing to protect one's health. Some pamphlets went so far as to insist that reading alone, especially at night, could encourage nervous disorders and fainting episodes triggered by overexcitement or excessive empathy. And then came the melodramatic novels, the ones dripping with emotion like lanterns dripping with warm wax. These stories featured cliffhangers so bold they could have been classified as emotional ambushes. Readers followed along breathlessly, page after page, until a shocking twist sent them reeling. More than one Victorian diarist recorded fainting after a particularly tumultuous plot turn. While modern readers might gasp or shout at a book, Victorians opted for horizontal processing. Suspense novels caused their own brand of chaos. A single unexpected revelation, the murderer suddenly revealed, the betrayal exposed, the secret origin disclosed, could send a reader's pulse racing at dangerous Victorian speeds. Parents fretted that their children would faint from fright or confusion, especially if reading alone in the dim glow of a candle. The idea of a child being startled by a climactic sentence and passing out dramatically onto their schoolbook was a recurring parental nightmare. Romance novels were perhaps the most scandalized of all. The notion that fictional characters could hold hands, exchange heated glances, or dare to confess forbidden feelings was enough to send propriety spiralling. Women were warned that reading love scenes could inflame their imaginations, and men were warned that such material might lead to distraction from noble pursuits. Fainting was an accepted side effect of romance, both on the page and in the reader. The more swoon-worthy the hero, the more swooning actually happened. But the fainting wasn't always from shock. Some Victorian readers fainted from sheer emotional intensity, overwhelmed by the tragedies of fictional characters who suffered heartbreaks, illnesses, sacrifices, and deaths rendered with poetic flourish. A beautifully written sentence could strike directly at the nerves of a society that encouraged emotional constraint. People who couldn't cry in public could faint in private, a loophole in Victorian emotional legislation. Even the physical act of reading contributed to fainting spells. Many Victorians read for hours in dim or stuffy rooms, curled in awkward positions that restricted airflow and circulation. Combined with the thrill of absorbing dramatic literature, the lack of ventilation and the strain on the eyes sometimes resulted in dizziness. When imagination and physiology teamed up, fainting was almost guaranteed. Publishers took advantage of the moral panic. Advertisements whispered that their novels were so gripping they might overwhelm the senses, using fainting as a bizarre badge of honour. Readers bought these books hoping to experience this transportive effect, as if fainting validated the story's artistry. Fainting transformed into literary street cred, proof that one had truly felt the narrative in their bones before gravity intervened. Of course, fainting also became a convenient excuse. Being caught reading a racy novel, claim fainting due to overstimulation, getting into trouble for devouring a sensationalist serial instead of doing chores. Blame a dizzy spell brought on by excessive emotional depth. Even critics fainted theatrically in lectures to prove that certain books were too dangerous, collapsing mid-sentence for dramatic effect, leaving audiences both alarmed and mildly unconvinced. As the century progressed, society adjusted to the idea that novels didn't actually touch souls or melt nerves. Fainting slowly waned as reading became more mainstream, and moral panic shifted toward newer threats. But in the height of the Victorian era, when imagination was an unpredictable force and literature a conduit for unexplored feelings, fainting over a book wasn't just plausible, it was expected. Victorian public bathhouses were meant to be wholesome, communal spaces where citizens could wash off the city's grime, refresh their bodies, and emerge sparkling with moral cleanliness. In practice, they were steamy chambers of social anxiety, nudity-related panic, and questionable hygiene rituals that made people faint for reasons both dramatic and deeply personal. Half the fainting was from heat, The other half was from seeing your neighbour without his hat. If you want to understand the Victorian relationship with bathhouses, imagine trying to relax while simultaneously overheating, pretending not to see anyone's bare elbows, and silently praying no one slipped on the tile. Bathhouses arose out of necessity. Many urban homes lacked proper plumbing, forcing people to seek cleanliness elsewhere. But unlike the serene spa environments we picture today, Victorian bathhouses were crowded, noisy, and smothered in clouds of steam, thick enough to hide a marching band. Families, labourers, clerks, and gentlemen of varying degrees of modesty trickled in throughout the day, clutching towels and self-consciousness in equal measure. The air was humid, the tiles were slippery, and the overall atmosphere felt like being inside a giant soggy lung. Entering the bathhouse meant stepping into a wall of heat that greeted you with all the subtlety of a slap. Steam pooled at ankle height, drifted towards ceilings, and curled around rafters like living fog. Many Victorians, unaccustomed to such intense humidity, felt their lungs rebel instantly. Breathing became a gentle struggle. The heart raced, vision blurred. People fainted before even reaching the changing area, sliding to the floor with the grace of a wet rag. Attendants grew adept at spotting newcomers who didn't yet understand the cardinal rule of public bathhouses: pace yourself or the heat will pace you right into unconsciousness. Inside the main chambers, awkwardness reigned. Victorian society was obsessed with modesty, layers of it, and the idea of encountering a co-worker, neighbour or distant cousin in a state of undress was enough to make even the most composed citizen wobble. Many fainting incidents were attributed not to heat, but to social panic. Imagine removing your gloves just to find Mr. Pembroke from the stationery shop standing 3 feet away, bare-chested, whistling and completely unaware that he had just emotionally stunned you into collapse. Nudity was a shockingly intimate thing for people accustomed to covering everything from collarbones to ankles. Bathhouse etiquette tried to ease the tension. People averted their eyes, spoke in hushed tones, and wrapped towels like the armour. But towels slipped. People bumped into each other through the fog. The sight of a familiar face uncomfortably stripped of Victorian conventions caused sudden drops in blood pressure. Even a glimpse of someone's shoulders, normally hidden under 3 layers of fabrics, could trigger a small fainting episode. And the echoes didn't help. Every cough, splash and shuffle reverberated like a disorienting soundtrack, contributing to the dizzying ambience. The bathing process itself often brought fainting dangerously close. Hot water, while blissful in moderation, was poured into tubs with the enthusiasm of someone trying to poach a ham. People soaked until their skin pruned, pores opened, and internal thermostats malfunctioned. Bath attendants encouraged vigorous scrubbing, which sometimes left bathers lightheaded long before they felt clean. Add in the sudden transition from hot rooms to cooler corridors, and the body occasionally decided to lie down uninvited. Some bathhouses included steam rooms, enclosed spaces where hot vapour swirled with such density that breathing became more of a suggestion. Patrons sat inside until their faces flushed beet red, and their thoughts floated somewhere between "I'm relaxing" and "Is this how I die?" The moment they tried to stand, their knees buckled. Countless fainting episodes were caused by people attempting to exit too quickly, stepping from the sauna-like heat into cooler air and immediately discovering that their blood had made other plans. The baths weren't always sanitary, either. Water was replaced, yes, but not as frequently as one might wish, and hygiene protocols varied. The scent of soap mingled with the scent of other things. People fainted simply from inhaling steam infused with unfamiliar aromas. Some bathhouses used disinfectants with harsh, pungent odours that flooded the air with sharp notes strong enough to make anyone woozy. Combined with heat, the fumes sometimes became fainting potions disguised as cleaning products. Bathhouse mishaps created an additional layer of drama. Slippery tiles engineered a variety of accidents, tripping, doing unintended acrobatics. More than one fainting spell was triggered by witnessing someone else slip spectacularly, or hearing a loud crash echo through the fog. The mind filled in whatever horrifying image seemed most plausible, sending people's nerves spiralling into unconsciousness. It didn't help that lifeguard-style supervision wasn't standard. Attendants occasionally found fainted patrons only because they noticed an unattended pair of shoes. There were also the sensory assaults. The contrast of hot water, cold air, strong smells, echoing voices, and the sight of unfamiliar body shapes created a perfect psychological storm. For many Victorians, accustomed to measured conversation and predictable routines, bathhouses offered too much stimulation. The body took one look at the whole experience, the heat, the nudity, the proximity to strangers, and simply checked out for the afternoon. Despite the fainting risks, bathhouses remained popular. They offered relief from the grime of city life, moments of warmth during cold seasons, and a rare chance for physical relaxation. Over time, patrons adjusted, learning how to navigate the heat, avoid staring at neighbours, and manage the steam without panicking. But fainting never vanished entirely. It lingered in bathhouses like a silent participant, waiting for the next moment when a gentleman glimpsed someone's exposed elbow and decided that the floor was the safest option. By the end of the 19th century, fainting had become more than a reflex, more than a fragile constitution issue, more than a medical mystery wrapped in lace. It had become a full-blown cultural meme, an expected punchline, a dramatic punctuation mark, a socially acceptable exit strategy from awkward situations. Fainting wasn't a symptom, it was a lifestyle choice. If there was a bewildering new invention, an unexpected social moment, an emotional revelation, or a room with questionable ventilation, the Victorian solution was simple: collapse gracefully and deal with it later. To understand why fainting climbed to meme status, you have to step back and view Victorian society as a masterpiece of contradictions. On the surface, the era projected restraint, reserved manners, rigid etiquette, the emotional equivalent of tight corsets. But beneath that polished exterior churned intense feelings, anxieties, moral dilemmas, and a society racing forward technologically faster than anyone could comfortably handle. When your world suddenly fills with trains, telegraphs, photography, chemistry, gaslighting, and industrial noise, your nerves need somewhere to go, and Victorian nerves often chose the floor. Social expectations played a significant role. Fainting became a performance of delicacy, sensitivity, refinement, almost a badge of moral depth. If a situation overwhelmed you, collapsing wasn't just acceptable, it proved you had a soul tuned to a higher emotional frequency. A dramatic swoon communicated everything from shock to disapproval, grief to amazement, without the risk of actually speaking. And in a culture where speech was heavily monitored by propriety, fainting provided a loophole. No one could accuse you of reacting incorrectly if you simply weren't conscious. Women in particular navigated a landscape where fainting could be both a symptom of physical constraint and a social tool. Corsets restricted breathing and blood flow, yes, but fainting also allowed women to escape uncomfortable conversations, unwanted proposals, or situations where propriety demanded retreat but words would have been too bold. A well-timed swoon could redirect an entire gathering, shift social dynamics, or provide a momentary escape from suffocating expectations. Men fainted too, though more quietly and usually under the guise of medical distress rather than emotional overflow. Society wasn't eager to label male fainting as dramatic flair, but that didn't stop gentlemen from collapsing when confronted with intense situations. Shocking speeches, graphic anatomy lessons, or anything that rattled their stoic facade. Doctors and scientists of the era recorded fainting among men far more often than Victorian novels ever admitted, proving that dramatic collapses belonged to everyone, not just women in gloves. Medical misunderstanding added another layer of chaos. Physicians threw around terms like nervous exhaustion, hysteria, or delicate constitution without grasping underlying causes. Instead of identifying heat stroke, respiratory strain, sensory overload, or emotional stress, they diagnosed fainting as proof of inherently fragile personalities. Treatment options ranged from smelling salts to soothing teas, with little investigation into environmental or social triggers. Fainting was medicalized when convenient, dismissed when inconvenient, and rarely examined with true scientific curiosity. Then came the speed of progress. The Victorians lived at a crossroads where tradition collided with innovation at breathtaking speed. Every decade brought inventions that unsettled those accustomed to slower, quieter lives. Photography stole souls, allegedly. Trains threatened to tear bodies apart at 30 miles per hour. Electricity hummed with invisible force, and balloon ascents dabbled too close to the heavens. Each advancement demanded emotional adaptation, something Victorian society never fully mastered. Fainting filled the gap between shock and comprehension. Public culture devoured these collapses. Newspapers recounted fainting spells at political rallies, theatre premieres, church sermons, and scientific exhibitions. Serialized stories included swoons as plot essentials. Even etiquette guides discreetly mentioned how hosts should handle a fainting guest, preferably without panicking or spilling tea. Fainting migrated from medical texts to comedic commentary, becoming shorthand for Victorian drama at full intensity. Theatrical fainting gained its own reputation. Audiences fainted during operas, actors fainted backstage, and playwrights wrote scenes so emotionally crushing that fainting became a reasonable audience response. Performers studied how to collapse convincingly without injuring themselves. Makeup artists even had tricks for enhancing the pallor of a fainting character. In short, fainting wasn't merely tolerated, it was embraced as a meaningful cultural gesture. And then there's the simplest truth of all: fainting worked. It stopped arguments, halted embarrassing moments, paused uncomfortable conversations, and summoned immediate care and attention. A fainting person was a social emergency, temporarily beyond reproach, and surrounded by caretakers armed with fans, water, and anxious concern. For people trapped in rigid social structures, fainting offered a socially sanctioned moment of escape, a brief strike against expectations, obligations, and the pressure to remain perfectly composed at all times. By the time the 19th century drew to a close, fainting had become a cultural shorthand for everything the Victorians feared, admired, and misunderstood about themselves. It symbolized vulnerability in a world that demanded endless performance. It revealed the tension between outward propriety and inward turmoil. It captured the age's uneasy dance with modernity, emotion, and change, and it persisted because on some level, society needed it. A dramatic release valve for a century constantly teetering between awe and anxiety. The final curtain fell on Victorian fainting, as the 20th century ushered in new norms, new technologies, and new attitudes toward emotion and health. But the legacy lingers in our imagination. The swooning Victorian remains a timeless symbol, part comedy, part tragedy, part social commentary. A reminder that sometimes the most dramatic response to overwhelming life is simply to stop participating for a moment and hope gravity is kind. And with that, our fainting odyssey completes its arc, from ankles to opera houses, from ghosts to gaslight, from soul-stealing cameras to overheated bathhouses. The Victorians may have mastered many things, but staying upright was rarely one of them.